So hi everybody, we're Kilograph. We're located in Los Angeles. We're an architectural and design visualization company. Today we're discussing a project we did nearly a year ago, and it's a competition for an NFL football stadium in a major US city. It's in Atlanta for the Falcons. The project represents a typical competition scenario for our office, and the images all place a premium on the overall impression that they create rather than, as I said, the specific details of the design. They're about big moves and big ideas. So we want to share our process on these views with you while introducing some techniques, not all of which were used on this project, in full disclosure, but techniques which we have been adopting into our studio, which improve our workflows and communicate our designs to our clients. So these are the images that we're going to be discussing. This is the bowl interior. We'll refer to it just as interior. The exterior image, the primary hero exterior, and then the aerial, a comprehensive aerial of the project in the city of Atlanta. So this is an overview of some of the challenges that we face on a typical project. And you would all be familiar with these working in visualization or being architects. Obviously, tight deadlines is a big part of what we have to deal with. Assets and direction are updating throughout the project, meaning that as the design evolves, we receive updated information, often later than we would like. We have strategies to deal with this, many of which we'll go through today. And then something that we struggle with is, with multiple images, maintaining a consistent style throughout the images without being what we refer to as formulaic, meaning how do these images all appear to have come from the same office while not being generic? And a lot of that has to do with our post-production workflow, which is a large part of what we'll be discussing with you. So we have scheduled review periods with our clients. Work in progress 1, work in progress 2, and the final, which includes a lot of back and forth in these competition scenarios. We have a workflow between these, which we share with our clients. So from the very beginning, we're really clear about what it is that we'll be producing for work in progress 1, where to focus feedback so that we can move forward efficiently, where to focus feedback for work in progress 2, and having a schedule that defines when we would like to receive that feedback so that we can keep moving forward smoothly. It's not always the case, but usually when you lay it out from the beginning, it works very well. We have a number of scripts and plugins that we use. We'll be demonstrating those today. One of the most important plugins we've been using is Forest Pack. I don't know how many of you use it, but we find it extremely useful for everything from propagating entourage to obviously vegetation. It's a really great tool. And ultimately understanding how much of our efforts to focus in 3D versus 2D or post-production for every project. So how do we start? We usually start with the call. So we have a client call us up. We have a competition. It's a really exciting project, but it's due in 5 days. Can you guys do it? So we'll have a little chuckle amongst ourselves, and then we'll say, sure, we can do that for you. Let's talk about it. So getting started, we have a conversation, which is usually a lengthy conversation. We like to sit down with our clients and discuss what the objectives are. What is it that you want to achieve from these images ultimately? How are they going to be shown? What do you really want them to communicate? And be very clear about what the limitations are from our end in 5 days or in 2 weeks, which is more typical. What can we do and what can we not do? And that allows for a really smooth workflow from the get-go with our clients. What stage are you at in this design? Are you at sketches? Is this already in a 3D sort of schematic stage? Are we hopping in near the end of the competition? And that allows us to schedule our work accordingly. How much time can we actually spend in 3D? Or are we just going right into 2D after a very fast exercise? And then obviously understanding what it is that we'll be receiving. Are we going to be building this? Are we getting models? If so, in what format? Do we have site photography? We need that, even if it's at a low resolution, because otherwise, with a tight turnaround, we can't always fly to the location to take our own photography. So we need to rely on something to help set the stage for us. And then we'll put our team together, decide who we need to do what. Is it going to be a post process primarily? Are we going to need more 3D artists? Really on Atlanta, I would say that we had most of our efforts spent in post-production. And finally, just being very, very clear about what it is that we'll be delivering when. I think I can't stress that enough, just to make sure that that's clear from the beginning of the process. This is a typical workflow for us with our clients. We receive all of our assets and information after this initial call, and we enter into a process of exploration for our office, our team in-house, which is assimilating all of that and creating mood boards, and then these clay renders, which we'll talk about in some detail. And then we send back our first work in progress, and that's our interpretation of this conversation, of these initial assets. We're defining our cameras, we're defining our lighting, and there'll be a bit of back and forth after that first transmittal of materials. And then we get into the details. So that's materializing some basic post-production so that we're communicating again from the beginning how we imagine these images will be rolled out. We're using scripts at this phase. We'll be getting into that. This is where we start using Forest Pack and leveraging things like proxies so that our team works really efficiently. We're not wasting time waiting for the render. We've got some great render settings for this middle phase that we'll share with you that allow things to go very, very quickly so that we can spend most of our time in this final area, which is post. So we want to be as efficient as possible through this period so that we can get into this period more quickly I would say, on almost every project. So now we're going to go into each of those phases in detail, sharing our workflow on these images, beginning in Max and then going through to Photoshop. So determining the look and feel, we gather all the reference imagery from our clients, have that initial discussion, and understand, factors like weather, what is the overall impact of the images, and then we develop our own internal mood boards. So this is some of the imagery that we receive from our client. So it's a combination of aerial imagery, shots of the existing football stadium, and then a lot of shots of what they refer to as Falcons Landing, which is where the tailgating parties happen, and there's this really intense activity with an intense color. And we noticed going through all of these images, certain patterns emerging. It became clear that the color red was going to be a major focus for the images. It became clear that we had to somehow show this intense activity without it feeling crazy, essentially. How to organize the crowds from the aerial perspective was going to be very important. It had to follow a certain pattern that would be what you would typically see. And then we review the initial assets that we received from the client. In this case, we received a fairly detailed model, which changed regularly, I would say, throughout the process. So dealing with a heavy, complex geometry that was updating is something that we had to develop a workflow for. Having a site plan also that was updating throughout the project was something that we had to manage, and that was a large part of that we handled in post-production. And so the images that we shoot back to our client, I'm going to go through them per rendering. For the interior view, Jason can talk to these images.
Sure. So some of the main focuses in the interior that we noticed were obviously the focus is on the field. That's our brightest point, and our secondary brightest point would be the lights coming from the top of the structure. In almost any stadium, this seemed to be the trend. So As you can see in the images, there's also a tier of darkness to light from top to bottom. So those were kind of some of the things that we needed to focus on and point out to the client, so that we felt like the images could end up either really flat or really have a lot of depth in them. And these are some of the important things that would bring out that depth.
This is for the exterior image, mood board.
So basically, in this exterior, we gather some references regarding the location where the stadium was placed, also how vegetation was going to affect the building around. We also had like a nice reference in how we want to see the reflection over the shell of the skin of the building. We also find information about the mood color and how the background was going to work for this image. We also have a reference of the color that Kelly was mentioning before, like how important the red was going to be during the whole process. So in the shot we work, for the exterior shot, we basically set up a sunset light and how we managed to make a transition between the sunset light and the red color to create an identity over the stadium.
And for the comprehensive aerial, we had to achieve a balance between seeing the horizon, the city of Atlanta in the distance, and actually looking into the bowl so that you could understand what was happening, the activity inside of the stadium itself. So we gathered reference imagery which achieved this effect, understanding depth, how we were going to represent the city. We'll be discussing that in post-production, what the freeways would really feel like from that vantage point, and then some of the colors that we wanted to work with for that view. So once we gather that information, we begin the process of importing the assets, and we'll be discussing this in some detail. So we have some scripts that we like to use to bring in the geometry, which is very time-saving for us. It comes from Rhino right into Max very nicely. We do some basic cleanup of the models always, not necessarily adding detail at this stage if it's not required, but just getting a nice clean model that we can work with, breaking it into layers that we all understand in the office so the file can be shared between any member of the team at any time. And I should mention that our in-house organization is one of the key components to having a really smooth workflow, being highly organized, again, not formulaic, but really, really organized. And also best practices, so remembering the scale obviously is very important to us. As we start to add entourage, it needs to come in at the right scale, roads, et cetera, all very important. And then we'll go into the composition and framing, the initial framing exercise for each of the views, how we determine that view. As I said, there were some requirements that come from the client in terms of what they want to see, obviously, and what they want these images to be used for in their presentation. But we can always assist in the process of creating a great composition. And once we have our cameras, we move into what we refer to as the clay render, which we'll demonstrate. And the clay render is essentially a way of focusing feedback on the composition itself and on the lighting without distracting. In our case, we experimented also with an override for the skin. It's important to understand what the reflection would be doing vis-a-vis the sun angle. And this is a stage where we begin to experiment with different types of lighting. Is HDRI going to be the most effective for us? Do we just need a direct light? What's going to help us achieve this look and feel? So in terms of composition, these are some images that we've been inspired by. Generally, best practices in composing our camera angles, and many of them were applied in this project. Maybe Freddie wants to speak to these a bit.
Yeah, so basically what we have in here is a great reference imagery from Julius Schulman. I don't know if you are familiarized with this amazing photographer. So we bring this image in here just somehow to explain principles of composition. So I'm just going to go through these principles really quickly. So in the first shot, we got a layering composition, which means like we're going to have depth in the first layer, which is going to be a foreground layer, a middle ground layer. So in this composition, the main key is to have different layering to get depth into the image. Another principle of composition, or that was used by this photographer, was that vertical lines will always stay as vertical 90 degree, and the horizontal lines will never be flat, which means like all the horizontal lines will have perspective. He also worked very well the framing of the images. So we're gonna see clearly, like in this element, in here in this photo, how framing start helping us to create depth into the image, but also to our certain type of detail. Also, there's some furniture in here in this image that is also helping to develop the whole animation of the photography. So we're going to be explaining later on what the rule of thirds is in composition, but for now, we just want to share like how this photographer was doing the composition and how somehow we recreate those composition rules that he used in our composition.
So again, our project, we didn't necessarily have to deal with vertical lines as we had a form that was very organic. But many of these principles we do bear in mind when we're setting up our cameras for these types of early explorations. So this is one of the clay render image boards that we sent to our client for the exterior images of the bowl. You can see that we used an HDRI on the upper and lower right-hand sides of the image, and then we experimented with V-ray, sun and sky, but always bearing in mind sort of a thirds composition. We tried different types, framing centrally, vertical portrait format, more of a horizontal format. This is really the moment when we go through all of our possible ideas for these shots. What's that?
Peter. HDRI.
Yeah. And then this is one of the early images of the interior of the bowl. And we'll go into this in, again, some detail. But for this shot, it was important for us to add some very basic materials so we knew where the focus was. And then we were playing a lot with lighting. And Jason's going to go through this in Max, how this was set up. But this was essentially our work in progress, one submission for this rendering. For the exterior view, again, as I mentioned, the override material, it allowed us to really emphasize the reflection. That's something that was important in the mood board that Freddie discussed. And then the framing, often it's a conversation, the framing. It's not always exactly what we would have imagined, but we end up achieving a pretty great compromise in most of these situations. And then the exterior, the aerial shot. Okay, so Jason's going to show you how we set most of these things up in Max.
All right, so I'm going to start with just kind of importing some basic geometry from Rhino and cleaning it up, and some good practices to remember inside of Max when getting a Rhino model in particular. Let's see, so the best format for most geometry at a Rhino is the SAT format, simply because you can control, once you get it into Max, the subdivisions of curves and more organic surfaces. The other option is usually 3ds or OBJ out of Rhino, and that's usually with meshed objects. So sometimes within Rhino you'll get grasshopper geometry or more developed geometry from, for instance, AutoCAD or Revit or something that they brought into Rhino and modified. So that's when you would want to use OBJ or 3ds. But for the most part, I would say stick to SAT files. When you're importing SAT files, you start with one. So it's good to remember the first layer that you're starting with. So I usually just go from the top. If you hit open, these are the options that we get. I think it's more of a preference thing, but you can choose to weld your surfaces by default or not weld them. Depends on how much you want to get into cleaning up on your end inside of Max. So normally I just stick to single body, no welding. The next options that we have are the mesh quality, how it's going to import. So basically, this is something that we can modify after the fact, once the model's inside of Max, or this is an upfront refinement of the mesh. So it's good to just put it on coarse or medium so it'll import faster for you. The trimming, we don't necessarily need this because we're not welding anything, so we can modify that at a later time. I never worry about these because for the most part when we get Rhino files, something up front that's good to ask for is to make sure it's oriented in the proper z-axis for you. Your z should be more or less north or south, up or down, and you should be all set. So if you hit select additional files right here, you can select the rest of the files that we exported. And I'm just going to warn you, this is not the same project. We couldn't get a hold of the Rhino files for this project, so this is a different project that we're going to show you. So you can see at the bottom it's loading all the layers. One thing I forgot to mention is that inside of Rhino there's a script that I use that's available online. I think it's on rhinoscripts.org or rhinoscripts.com. You can export by layer. So basically, if your client sets up your Rhino file by material or by object or whatever your preference is, we usually ask for by material. It will go through automatically and export a single layer for your organization when you get it into Max. So as you can see here, Paul Nichols, everybody. As you can see here, we have our model that we just imported and all our layers with the same naming that we had in Rhino. So a good thing here is so it'll automatically collapse things for you. For instance, if I isolate the beams, they had all the beams on this layer. Nothing will be welded by default because that's what I told it to be, or how it should interact when I import it. And they come in as a body object. And a lot of times body objects, if you don't make them meshes, will render strangely. You'll get artifacts that you don't see in your viewport. So the first thing I normally do with model cleanup, this is not as organic as our stadium, obviously, but if we have a lot of curved surfaces, I can take this. The body object by default will look like it's supposed to, but you can see these edges that don't line up with the geometry. That's because when we imported, we told it to be medium quality. And when I said ignore that on import, it's because you can change that here. So if you put it on fine, you can see it automatically lines up with the edges. So it's important to kind of run through your geometry and make sure that important pieces of your geometry that are curved or might be prominent in your renderings are refined before you mesh them. Because if you mesh this, it's not going to line up and it's going to look like basically a big nasty mesh. So if we undo that, you can put it on fine by default. This face approximate angle right here, the lower the value you go, the smoother it's going to make your edges. So if I put this at, let's see, yeah, so 15. I'm sorry, it's this, the face distance percentage. can leave this at 4, and there's a balance between these two numbers, so you can see if I go up, it's going to make it back to the faceted version, but the lower the value you get, the smoother it brings it out. So then you can mesh it and weld if you want. Clear your smoothing, that's another good practice. And auto smooth just by default. Sometimes when you mesh your objects, your smoothing gets kind of screwy, and if you render, you'll get some dark spots on geometry here and there. And one other thing I do, just because I can't stand looking at geometry like this, it's good to auto edge. So where is auto edge? Oh, it's got to be a poly first. Sorry about that. Where the hell is that? Oh yeah, there it is. So you hit auto edge. Sorry, I didn't see it at the bottom. So it just cleans up your mesh. So I have edges being shown. You can see up here. And it just cleans up your mesh. Normally I use a script for that. That's why I forgot where it was. Another good script to use in here is quick collapse. Basically, it's the same as the default max collapse, which comes in your utilities tab over here. So if we have a bunch of stuff, this model is pretty clean as it is. Let's say we have all these things, say there's 1,000 mullions that are attached to this, and normally if you use the max collapse, it's really slow and it won't clear the cache as you're collapsing. So there's this script you can get on script spot. That basically runs through and collapses it super quick because it dumps the cache every time it collapses an object. So it's super fast. You can make a menu for it or a tab or however you like to use your scripts. And that's basically as far as Rhino import goes. That's the process until you get it all on a layer. Basically, after we get the whole model all collapsed and cleaned up, we'll throw it by material. Our common practices as far as layering goes is keeping all building objects on a building underscore layer. So it's just easy when you're working with a team under pressure for someone to open your file and understand what you're doing. So say this is a metal railing. Oops. Turn this off. So say it's a metal railing on our building. Why can't I type? Turn override keyboard. Why is my keyboard not working? All right, sorry. So basically all building materials will sort by material with the building prefix on the layer. So building underscore metal, building underscore glass. Site stuff will go on a site layer. So site grass. Site concrete. We keep all our sun lights and cameras at the top, so it's good to maybe just put a dash before it. Put lights so it stays up at the top. So anytime somebody comes into your file, there's going to be nothing on the 0 layer. Everything will have a layer with a prefix, so it's understood. So if you come to the bottom down here, it's easy to understand what's on what layer, no matter who's working on this file. So a lot of times last second we'll get a request for a change or a material change or move a tree here, move a tree there. So we'll have all these layers situated so somebody can come in and Forest Pack can go on a FPP layer. So it's just easy to understand everybody's file. All cameras on a camera layer. Again, stays at the top. If you need to turn it off, it's easy just to turn all that stuff off. And that's pretty much it as far as cleanup goes. I think now we're going to go into composition and clay renders. So I'll open the actual bowl scene. And here's that Rhino script I was talking about. Rhino's not installed on the machine, so we can't show you, but basically when you're in Rhino, all you want to do is go up to the Tools menu, go into Plugins, and you load this plugin, you run it, and you hold the Enter key, and it'll export every layer automatically for you. When the window pops back up, it's done. And it'll save it all in a folder just like this with all your SAT files. And at the end of the class, I can give you a link to where you can download these scripts that I'm using. So this is our basic import. This was our first, turn this off. This was our first imported model from the client. We threw some people in there just for scale sort of thing. There's some people in the stands over here. If I turn this off. So basically, I want to talk about composition, setting your viewport up for the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is basically keeping your image. It kind of lends itself to what Freddie was just referencing with those photographs. Basically, breaking your image up into thirds for focal points. So you can use these points in your viewport as your focal points, and if you oftentimes, like for the exterior, if we want to center, if we have our building in the center of the image, we want to use our horizon line on a third. So there's not always going to be a focal point on these 4 points, for instance. So you can see this better. I'll open a JPEG. Basically, this is how we've broken up our viewport. These are those points, the focal points we're talking about, and also points of interest in your image can be in any one of these thirds. It's just good practice and naturally attracts the eye to certain objects or things you want to call out in your scene. So if you come back to Max, I can show you how to set that up in your viewport. So if you go to Configure Viewports and you go to Save Frames, by default lock is on and these are off. So you don't see any of these lines in your viewport. So you can see right now it's kind of just a guessing game and what looks good. So to make that clearer, click your little plus sign up here, configure viewports. Turn the action safe and title safe on. If you unlock these, you can control these horizontal and vertical values. So that's how you break up your viewport. And 66 in the horizontal and 66 in the vertical here breaks it up for you evenly. And should it come back on? Oh, got to turn these on. There we go. So now when we're moving cameras around or flying around our viewport, it's just easier to understand. So I'll move this camera around so you can see it. You can see in our viewport we have the same setup as I showed you here. So however you scale your aspect ratio, it'll resize itself. And to set up cameras, most of the time I use this walkthrough mode. So basically it's like playing a video game. You just use your arrow keys at the bottom. And you can fly around It's just easier to get a feel for the stadium rather than if you're using your viewport all the time or your top viewport. I feel like you're restricted to only what you're seeing in that viewport. So this is good to kind of get some more unique views, find areas of interest, for instance, these lights up here, while keeping the field at the bottom right hand of our viewport in focus. So it's good to frame images, a quick way to kind of kick out a bunch of cameras if your client is asking for multiple views. So I'll run through what we had in here. These are more or less the views that we sent. We were exploring some views and getting options from all over in the stadium. So more personal views from down on the lower levels, going back to our reference images that Keely showed in the beginning of photos of stadiums. This was a similar view. Another one from a little higher up. And then the one that the client selected. So I think this view was selected because it's framed pretty nicely. We use a lot of the structure up here to frame the left corner. Structure frames the right corner. We have a lot of action in the foreground that we could do. People in the foreground, lights, and it also centers the field in the bottom third of our image. So that goes back to the rule of thirds, and it's handy to have it on your screen. You can kind of see that the field is the focus of our image, but there's also a lot of other interesting things going on in the other thirds. So we have to keep that in mind and think ahead that when we're going to be painting this, how it's going to be possible to draw our eye to this area. So once we got our camera set up, we go into clay renders and basically test render settings. So I'll just go through this very quickly. It's not anything too particular, but there's a few tricks that help speed up the process, because at this point we don't need to send super refined images to the client. We don't need details in our shadows or really refined lighting. So the key thing when you're test rendering, I think in your image sampler, using fixed mode is huge, because it basically it's a fixed pixel, basically the way it solves your pixels in your scene, it's a fixed rate. So there's only one setting for this. If you have it at 1, it's calculating the pixel once, rather than if you're using adaptive DMC, it's basically giving it a number to figure out in your scene what needs to be smooth, what needs to be sharp. And Freddie will go into more detail with this for our final render settings. So sticking to fixed mode will give you super rough edges on your geometry, but at this point, like I said, it doesn't really matter. It's all about the composition, and it's all about the composition and what the client is seeing. So I'll do a test render and show you what fixed mode does. So you can see how it our aliasing is very, very jagged and not so smooth, but again, it's not important at this point. It's just about composition. So that's the main thing that'll speed up your renders in test render mode. And again, the noise threshold. The higher you go on this number, the noisier your scene is going to be. So if you do 0.5, it's going to be very noisy, but it'll give you very fast results. And the lower you go, I think by default it's 0.03 when you turn this on. Basically just refines the noise in your scene. This is less important if you're using an override material, because we don't have glossies in our scene. We don't have things reflecting the environment. So basically it has less effect on the overall scene, but once you start test rendering materials and doing that sort of thing, this is important to keep in mind. GI settings are pretty basic. V-Ray comes with a bunch of presets that you can use. I usually just stick to very low. The subdivs, if you start with your hemisphericals this is basically the detail in your shadows. So if the higher you go, with this number, it's going to give you more detail in your shadows. This interpolation will smooth that detail out. So this reverse number here, this 40 with 100, is going to smooth out very little detail. So 40 is a pretty low number here. 100 is going to take that little detail and smooth it out just so that we get a nice even result over the image. For later quality in your image, you want to reverse these usually. So if you do like 60-40, it's going to smooth less but give you more detail in the shadow areas. Again, Freddie will talk about this a little more when we get to it. Light cache, again, just very simple. 400 subdivs is a good starting number. Usually renders pretty quick. The higher number you go here, the more detail you're going to get in your lighting solution. Freddie will talk about this as well. And that's basically it for our render settings. So the other thing is the override material. At this point, we don't care necessarily about showing materials either. So this override material is a good way to, if you had someone starting on this scene with materials and you just need to focus on your cameras, you can use this override material to give your scene one material and exclude certain objects that are important to you. Like Keely mentioned, one of the objects in this scene was the skin that we needed to override to be able to see light through it. So this material here, just drag it into your override slot, instance it so you can modify it in your material editor. And this override exclude is where you could pick certain objects in your scene that will actually render with the material that they're supposed to. So if I render, this region down here, it's going to show up as all white because we're using the override material. But say we need to see this red color, for instance, or how it's affecting our scene, we can exclude that object from the override. So you just copy the layer name, or select by material is another way to do it. If you include it in this, up here are your options for what it's doing. You can include, so this would only be the only object being overrode, or exclude it from illumination and shadows. You hit render. We get all the red objects in our scene, so you can see it's color bleeding, and this is good just for testing purposes if you have specific materials that you need to test. So that's how we use the override material. So our lighting setup, where are we going next? What am I doing next? Sun, sky, yep. So, what's that? Yeah. One sec. Oh, right. So to speed up your renderings, low thread priorities, also a good thing to turn on. What's that? Oh, okay. Why? What is that? All right, so I'm going to go over the lighting in our scene. Trying to focus here, guys. So again, as Keely touched on, using HDRs or using a V-Ray sun and sky is important in certain aspects.
I forgot to mention something. We use Peter Guthrie's HDRIs, and they're excellent.
Yeah, we use a lot of his, in the scene we use one of his images. They're all pretty solid. He goes out and takes his own photos, so they're all pretty unique to what you need. There's tons of options. And, so you can either start with, a lot of times we'll just start with a standard daylight system or a sunlight with a V-Ray sun and sky. So if I was to do that, I would do it on a layer that's not turned off. So I'm sure everybody knows how to use the daylight system, but I'll go ahead and run through it real quick. So to get this set up, I'll go in a new scene.
It's worth mentioning too that the just to touch on the override material again, it's just a standard V-Ray material. Some people use an ambient occlusion material for that, but we just find it faster to use a straightforward V-Ray material, not set to pure white. So.
Oh, good Lord. All right, so just to kind of get your lighting in place, it's good to start out with the V-Ray sun and sky. So if you go to your systems button over here and you drag your daylight into your scene, you'll have the option to change this to a V-Ray sun. And when you do that, it'll ask you if you want to use the V-Ray sky as your environment map. So usually up front, this is okay. You can just tell it yes. So when you render in your scene, you'll now have your V-Ray sun as well as your sky. You can control it with the date, time, and location. You can pick the location where your project is, which is sometimes good, or you can manually drag it around if you want to explore some angles that physically aren't possible, but want to get creative with it. So this is a good starting point. But with this scene, like I said, reflections were important, variation in the lighting, cloud shadows, things like that are things that you get from using HDR. So with an HDR, it's good to start with a V-Ray light. Basically, you just go to your lights, V-Ray light. If you click in your scene, it creates, by default, I think it goes to a plane light. So you want to turn it to a dome. And keeping your multiplier at 1 is good practice, specifically with Peter Guthrie's HDRs, because that's the way he exposes his files and has them set up to be used. So in your light, things that are important to remember are keeping this invisible on. So basically this is gonna tell it not to be visible to your camera when you're rendering, but it's gonna give you an alpha. It's gonna give you an alpha when you do render. If you have this unchecked, you won't get an alpha. So let's go to our light. All right, so I'll do a few tests here showing you the HDR and how it affects the scene. And for time's sake, rendering regions is pretty important. When you see people sitting at their desk rendering full resolution test images, there's a problem. It's just taking too long to do anything. So rendering regions with your low settings that we just went through is a super fast way to get results. So unless this was a... So you can see that it's affecting our alpha with the invisible turned on in our light settings. which is good for post-production down the road. We're going to need that alpha in our image. We want it reflecting, we want it affecting specular.
Yeah, there's a quick question online here. It said, Peter Guthrie recommends a gamma of 0.7, 0.9 to make his shadows sharper. He wanted to know what your opinion on that was.
Normally I don't get into that. I haven't experienced, if you're using EXRs versus HDRs, I think I've come to notice that you do lose contrast and you do lose detail in your shadows, but I haven't gotten too much into the values of the maps like that. The only thing that's pretty important to remember with your HDRs is that this resolution down here is also going to affect the quality of your light in your scene. So I forget what the default number is, but it's pretty low. So let's see. So at this point, it's kind of hard to tell. We'll come back to this a little later and show you once you up these settings. But this number basically controls the resolution of your map and the light quality coming from your dome light. So I think 2048 is the highest number you can get from it. And it doesn't affect your render times terribly at this point. So it's good to put it all the way up to see what your map's going to do. One thing when you're using an HDR is, by default, you don't see it in your viewport. So if you open your material editor, rotating it is one of the things that you're going to get your light point at a certain point in the HDR. So I'll open it in Photoshop. So basically, the way HDRs work, if you're not familiar with them, is they hold light. This is an image that holds lighting data. It's a full float image, 32-bit image, so you can fully expose or underexpose as if you're there shooting the photo, and Photoshop stopped working. So. Let's try it again. All right, so you can fully play with the exposure in the image. It's not good practice to adjust this in Photoshop and save it out as a new image. A lot of people will open it in here, underexpose it, and save it and use the HDR that way. Max has all these settings for you when you import HDRs into it. So I'm just showing you this to show you how it holds lighting data, and this is our sun point. So this is where, as if we're using a daylight system, this is affecting our scene the same way from this point. So that's our sun in our scene. So when you're in Max, let me go back into Photoshop. One thing that I normally do is save this out as a JPEG so that we can make it our background in our viewport. Here. JPEG.jpg. So, environment. Currently our environment is set up to HDR. I think you can display HDRs in your viewport as well. But see, when you use an HDR in your viewport, it's overexposed, so you're not going to be able to see it. So it's good to load a JPEG in here. So that you can actually see where your map is in your viewport. So one thing I normally do is just instance it in here, and as you're rotating this, you can use your offset here to kind of shift it around your viewport and see where you want your sun to sit. This isn't 100% accurate to where it's going to render, but it's pretty close. For instance, like if you render this, whoops. It's not going to line up perfectly where it is in your viewport, but it'll get you pretty close, close enough to adjust your scene and get your sun where you want it. So with the rotation value on here, yeah, so what I just did was turn off effect background. When you render with a JPEG in your viewport, it gamma corrects it so that it will render dark. So if you turn that off, sure. So if you turn that off, it'll render gamma corrected. That's why it looks dark.
Is there a reason why you're not using the VART at this point? Because that'll allow you to directly see the HDRI with the exposure as well. And further, did you set up already the exposure control?
I've used it a few times. This is kind of how I've done it for a long time, so I've kind of stuck to it. You can use VART for your initial setup. You can move your sun around in your scene, and it'll render real time for you. You can get your shadows and placement and all that by using RT. This is just as quick, I think, because our render settings are so fast that it only takes a few seconds to achieve this result, and it's just as visual by having your map in your viewport. I guess it's just a personal preference of mine.
And further, did you set up some camera exposures already?
No, I can run through that right now. All right, so when you're flying around your scene initially to set up your cameras, normally I'll turn this the override on, so you don't actually need a camera to render at the proper exposure. I think good practice is to balance out your shutter speed and your ISO at 100, and then you only have one number. A lot of times we don't render depth of field and camera effects like that into our scenes just because of render time. When you're working on competition, you don't really have time to sit there and test depth of field or bokeh and all those effects that you would get when you're taking a photo. So this F number is the only number you need to worry about at this point. If you balance these two numbers at 100, this is literally the only value that you'll need to change to adjust the exposure in your scene. So let's do this. And later on, when you get to your final render settings, you can go ahead and adjust these again, adjust these settings to your liking. If you want depth of field or things like that, you can balance those numbers out and turn them to what you need. So if I put this at 8, it's going to expose our image more. So the lower the value you go, the more it's going to expose your image. The higher the value, the more it's going to underexpose your image. So that's that. It just keeps it in one spot. And this override only affects when you're not in a camera, or if you're using a standard camera. If you're in a perspective mode, this override will control your exposure in your scene. But if you go to your V-Ray cameras, this override becomes obsolete. So basically your camera overrides this exposure control. And I can touch on a little bit of the camera settings within the V-Ray cameras. If you do want to render depth of field in, basically these cameras work like real cameras do. All the settings in here are as if you were taking a photo on your DSLR or your film camera, whatever you have at home. So we have your shutter speed, we have your ISO, and we have your aperture. We have all these settings that we can adjust in here, whoops, as well as vertical shift. And your temperature control of your white balance. So I think the common practice here, or the thing to keep in mind if you do want to render depth of field in your scene, you have to turn it on in your camera up here. And if you want motion blur, if you're animating something, you have to turn it on, activate it in your camera, and you can control it in your V-Ray settings as well within the camera rollout. Down here. So this works with your camera settings. I'm not going to go too much into this because this is about doing things quickly in production mode. But the shutter speed is how long your shutter speed is going to stay open. So the lower the value you go is how fast your shutter speed is going to close. The film speed is the sensitivity to light. And so when you're adjusting your shutter speed, when you're adjusting your F number, the lower the number you go here, the more depth of field you're going to get in your scene. So for instance, if you're using a prime lens or something, it's usually like 1.4 to 2.8. You're going to get a lot of depth of field up close in your camera. But this is balanced out. When you're doing this, your aperture of your camera is wide open, so you're going to get a lot of light into the lens of your camera. So you got to balance it out. Now these numbers come into play where I put them at 100. It's now going to affect our scene in a different way. I'll render it and show you. So our scene should be very bright right now because our lens is wide open. We're shooting wide open, and we're not controlling it currently with the ISO, the light sensitivity, or the shutter speed. And as you can see, it's already rendering very slow because of we turned depth of field on. I'm just going to turn it off for render speed purposes. So if you do get into this and want to render these effects into your scene, the way you balance it out is your shutter speed. If you go higher on this, for instance, I don't know, 1200, your shutter speed is going to close very fast, but your aperture is much wider, so you're kind of counteracting what the camera is doing. So you're letting more light in here, but you're closing the shutter much quicker, and your ISO is less sensitive to light at this point. So at 100 is a very low ISO. So if we render, we should get closer to what we want. It's obviously still overexposed because we're shooting wide open again at 1.4. So if you up this, so now we should be getting more what we want. But if I was rendering with depth of field turned on, we should be getting all the foreground elements would be blurring, depending on where we have our focal point set in our image. So again, this is all customizable. Later on, it comes into play up front. Like I said, I just override 100, 100, and then you only have one number to worry about. It's just not important at this point to worry about that stuff. And that's pretty much it as far as our light setup goes. All right, so when you're using HDRs, a lot of times you don't get the kind of direct light that you need in your scene, or maybe the combination of colors in your scene. Going to a direct light is a quick way to add some colors. So wherever you place your HDR, for instance, our sun was back here, so I drag a direct light into our scene, which you can find in your standard lights. This is one of the standard lights that came with Max from the get-go, pretty much. It renders very fast with V-Ray shadows turned on, or you can turn the shadows off if you only want your HDR affecting your scene. But a lot of times you get a lot of blue from these HDRs, so I balance it out with a warmer color direct light. So usually like a mid-orange value will give you some nice tones where the sun hits. And you can control what kind of shadows you want. V-Ray shadows, like I said, work very fast with direct lights. Your shadow parameters are pretty straightforward. Basically, if you leave area shadows off, area shadows are going to give you a more variation to your shadows. They're going to give you a hard point at the base of your object, and then it's going to blur as it goes out. So later on, you might want to adjust these, turn area shadows on, and adjust the size so you get more realism in your shadows. But by default, you can leave it off just for rendering speed. The light color, the multiplier here is going to be basically whatever you want it to be. I'll delete the HDR so you can see how it's affecting the scene. Just turn it off. So this is just our direct light in our scene. So you can see how it's giving us a lot of warmth in the scene. So that's exactly what this light is doing. Its purpose is just for highlights. And basically to draw attention where our sun is coming from, to exaggerate the HDR's sun direction. If I turn that light off, and I turn our HDR back on, you'll see how much blue and how purple our scene is by default, because that's the color of our HDR in our scene. But you're still getting some of that sun from the HDR, just not enough to our liking at this point. So when you turn those both on, copy this over. Oh, wrong viewport. So now we get a good balance of blues in our shadow from our skylight and our HDR, and then we get a nice highlight from this direct light in our scene. You can see here the HDR versus using both direct light and HDR. Just gives you more dynamic lighting in your scene. And you can also use a daylight system with this HDR or a V-Ray sun. It's just a matter of preference. The direct light renders just as fast, and you can control the color just as easy. Basically, they're the same thing. It's a matter of opinion.
If you use the V-Ray dome and the direct light, do they cast two types of shadows on your scene?
Can you repeat that?
Because the V-Ray dome casts shadows, and also the direct light will cast a shadow.
Right.
So you have two shadows right now.
Right. Since we're on the interior of the scene, I wouldn't do this normally on the exterior. Since we're on the interior, you're not getting very specific. Down here, it's a lot of soft shadows from our lighting within the dome. You're not noticing the two different shadows from the HDR and the direct light, because the direct light is set. The size is so large that all the shadows we're getting are from the direct light. So it's not necessarily something you have to worry about when you're using an HDR with a direct light or a V-Ray sun combo. At this point, I would say just a standard V-Ray sun and sky. It's if what's important to you is reflections, you should use an HDR because you're going to get better and more variety of reflections from the sky itself. But a standard V-Ray sun and sky is a pretty fast method for exteriors.
Because it was a really reflective object, we used HDRI, but typically we just start with a V-Ray sun and sky.
For this project, you also have exterior shots.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't use the HDRI on the exterior?
For this particular project, we did use HDRI. Particularly for the aerial, there was HDRI used, so you could really get the reflections. It helped us to sort of begin the process of determining the overall color.
So we just try to guess that the direct light and the HDRI have the same sun location, so the shadows will kind of blend.
I mean, you can link them.
I can actually reply that
And
answer that question. Like when we set up the lighting, is for the exterior shot, we used the HDRI, but the shadows were off, and the only shadows were from the main source, which was the V-Ray sun. Because in Jason approach to the interior, we don't really see shadows. We see shadows, but there are many spotlights inside that will somehow override those shadows, will bring light into those shadows. While in the exterior shot, it's definitely a good practice to just keep one shadow. Like whether you use the shadows in the V-Ray sun or you use it in the HDRI. So otherwise, we have to follow the technique that Peter Guthrie was using, like kind of link the HDRI with the V-Ray sun so we get an accurate shadows, exactly. So if we don't have that, if we don't use that technique, probably we're gonna have overriding shadows and the shadows won't be accurate enough. Right. So I definitely try to use just only one shadow, whether with HDRI or with the V-Ray sun. Yeah,
for the aerial, it was just HDRI, for instance.
Yeah, every scene is very different to what you think it needs. I think for this scene, the main reason I did that was to highlight this whole structure and highlight where the sun is breaking through during the game. So if you're looking at this image that I just opened, this is a good reference point for that. There's light coming through. It kind of adds atmosphere. You can see the daylight outside without going overboard with losing contrast in the overall scene.
Really important for this client was the actual light coming through that structure. So that same.
So getting these shadows and getting that light from the skin on this structure and points like to the left over here, where you're actually getting daylight in circulation spaces are things that are important to the client. They have to keep in mind while you're working. So it's not always about what you think at this point looks most dramatic or what's going to make
the best image, but it's a balance of the two, what the client wants and what you think is going to create a nice image. And what Freddie was saying with turning shadows on or off in your HDR, it's just an option. In the V-Ray dome light, you can turn cast shadows off here, and it'll still reflect, it'll still give you your specular highlights, and it'll still affect the diffuse color in your scene. You're just not going to get any shadows. All right.
So once we've sent out our work in progress and we adjust the cameras accordingly, if there are some changes to our camera angles, we basically move into the development, which is our work in progress too. So in this phase, can you get the second slide? We start to develop obviously the materials. So we can share materials between people on the team, or develop sort of unique materials depending on the view. We have some sort of optimized settings that we'll go over to make these things render more quickly and get us into post more quickly, even with the final render settings. We have a technique to create tiling textures like a brick and panels that we'll go through with you. It really saves a lot of time. We don't have to develop custom maps. Sometimes, of course, you need to, but it's a really great time saver, and again, gets you into post more quickly. So we'll be starting out by reviewing materials, textures, and then going into the proxies, which is basically best practices when using proxies, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, so a quick review of that, and then discussing Forest Pack in some detail using these scenes. So, Jason's gonna take it over again.
So I'll start out with the material stuff. I'm gonna go over, like Keely said, a few different materials, using the two-sided material to fake translucency on trees so that you can render translucent leaves without having crazy render times. Using the tiles texture within Max, it's something that has been inside of Max forever, and a lot of people overlook it. It's a nice procedural way to get textures and resolution out of your images up close, so you don't have to worry about the resolution of your JPEGs. If you can't find anything in a crunch that's high resolution enough to your liking. So basic concrete, just run through that really quick. Metal panel using tiles. Building road textures using the distance text, and I can also go through a few options with that, doing like field graphics, for instance, these logos in our scene on the field without having to model them in. In this scene, they already came with the scene, so we have a model of them, but I can use this geometry as a texture within Max. And also the V-Ray override material, which is an important one for color bleed and smaller scenes where you don't want a lot of color bleed in your scene, or if you have a lot of dark materials and your light is not bouncing properly, this is a good technique to use. So I'll start with the two-sided material. So basically what I have here is a leaf texture on a plane. So when we get models from Evermotion or whatever method you use as far as 3D trees or plants go in your scene, a lot of times they use the actual translucency in a V-Ray material, which renders very slow, and it's also very noisy. So they come with this turned on, usually hybrid with a back color to get your translucent color on the backside of your materials. So basically it works as an SSS material, which we don't need in most architectural renderings of this scale anyway. So I'll go ahead and I have a simple scene set up. This is a a leaf on a single-sided plane with a box behind it and a V-Ray light behind the box to create. This is the box, this is the V-Ray light, this is our leaf, to basically create the illusion of sun coming through this leaf. So by default, you can set up a very generic V-Ray material on your leaves. Normally when you get your plants, like I said, it'll have this translucency turned on. You can just turn it off, and that'll give you this very basic material. Oops. It'll give you this very basic material with no translucency to it, so it's going to render pretty flat in most of your scenes. And a lot of times, if your trees are at a distance, you don't need to do this at all. This is mainly for foreground trees. It's just a good effect to get. It also works well with animations. If you have trees blowing in your scene, naturally you'll get light through where light is hitting your leaf. So the way you use this is, first off, let me show you what it does. It's called the V-Ray two-sided material. So now you can see you're getting translucency, and it renders just as fast as it did without the translucency. The way it works is you wrap this. So this is our very basic leaf material right here. If you click this, you can wrap it in the two-sided material, which is at the top up here. You want to keep this old material within it. So it uses it as the front material by default, and that's what we want. This color and this value right here control the overall translucency of the leaf. So if you put it at white, and we apply this to this, we get a lot of translucency because this is the maximum value. If we put it at black, we should get no translucency on this leaf, or very little. So you can see this is one way to control it. So I think by default it just sets it on like a medium gray here. You can use a map within this slot, which is a good way to get like veins that don't shine, or you don't get any light through where thicker objects are, more or less. So like the veins on this leaf, you wouldn't get a lot of light through. So you can go into as much detail as painting these veins out and painting areas out that you don't want light to shine through for more realism. So I think I did that here for you. Yeah, so basically a map like this, wherever it's white, just like I showed you, is going to give you a lot of light through. Wherever it's black, you're not going to get any light through. So this map is inverted. So let's go ahead and use it. Invert the map and then hit render. So now it's using the map for our translucency. Basically, the map is controlling, like I said, where light is coming through and where light's not coming through. This one's not so apparent if you, let's say, I'll use this for example's sake. So you can see the map here, wherever there's white areas, wherever there's black areas, we're getting light through. So this is a good effect to speed your renderings up if you want a little more added realism in your plants and your trees. Any questions on that?
So we do this to our trees before we bring them into Forest Pack to start propagating them so everything renders faster, obviously.
Right. All right, so using the tiles texture to create brick, a lot of times people will rely on bitmaps for close-ups in their renderings, lose a lot of resolution using bitmaps, but tiles is a good procedural way to get a lot more resolution out of your textures. So I'll kind of run through this material and then set it up really quick. in your diffuse slot, I usually start with just a basic tiles material, embed it with the texture that you want on your brick. And this is your grout setup, so it gives you, if you're doing metal panel, if you're doing brick, if you're doing CMU block or whatever, they're all set up pretty much the same way. Within here, I have my color and I have an overlay of a concrete map just to get some texture on the brick. This is how this material renders currently. So as you can see, our sphere is pretty close to the camera, but it holds up fairly well. I would also have some displacement on here for a bit more depth in the material. So I'll go through the setup of something like this, and we'll recreate this really quick. So you start with your standard V-Ray material. For your diffuse, you gotta decide what color you want. Just start with your tiles map. This is what we're using to actually create this brick pattern. There's a lot of default stuff that you can choose from in here. Usually running bond or stack bond is the most common. So let me open this. So we'll go with a running bond. The way you control the amount of bricks by default is with these horizontal and vertical count. This is going to eliminate a lot of tiling in your material. So, you know, if you're using a 250 pixel by 250 pixel image, you're going to get tiling no matter what you're trying to do to get rid of it. As far as like a big flat surface goes, that's brick wall or metal panel. So I think the most you can go in here is 100, which makes your brick size very small. So if you adjust this grout, with the value that you're adjusting here, you're going to need to adjust the grout. You can see it'll kind of disappear if you go crazy on the number of bricks in your scene. But what we're getting out of this is a very high resolution brick texture. So you can see how many bricks here, and this will hold up as far as you zoom into it, as long as you're playing with your blur value here. So what this does is it blurs within your viewport. It blurs it at a distance, so viewing angle. So if you're looking at your map in your viewport here. Oh, let me turn off displacement. So since my blur value is down, it's very sharp along all these edges, so you're not losing any resolution when you're rendering. If we put this back at 1, or I'll go at a higher value so you can see what it's doing. See how it blurs our map? Less in the foreground, parallel to the camera, but more along the edges. This is by default a speed thing with Max. So if you have it at 1, it's going to render faster than if you do it at 0.25. But for stills, it's good practice to use 0.25 for everything, in my opinion, just because you get a lot more from your base image. You don't have to worry about painting detail and edges. You don't have to worry about detail that's going to be missing when you hit render. If you're wondering about the aliasing in the image, again, I'm using fixed mode just to speed things up. I can turn this to DMC so we can see how it's actually going to render. So we have our base brick texture in here. Here's where we control the actual texture that we're going to see on the brick face and the grout setup. So just to overdo it, I'll show you what's going on here. So you can see now, this is what the green is controlling, this is what the red is controlling. If you want more variance to your map, you can adjust this fade variance, which gives you a natural kind of breakup of, like when you're looking at bricks, not every brick is the same color, so this is going to vary the tone between the bricks. So you just want to slightly kind of bump that up. This is the color variance. So if you have a red brick, for instance, or an orange brick, and you want some color variance, these kind of do the same thing. This is affecting the hue and the color of your material. So normally I just I'll leave this at 0 and only mess with the fade variance and leave the color and the texture up to the maps that you're going to use in here. So you can embed maps into this. So if I go pick a random concrete material just for time's sake. Let's crop this so we don't get the edges. So what this is doing now is applying a very large concrete texture within our tiles. So to match the scale of our tile that we've adjusted here, we have a very large amount of tiles that we're showing. You can adjust the tiling within your map. So if I do this, it'll look terrible here. It's tiling a lot, but once you turn your bricks on, it's more to scale to the actual brick size in your scene. So you can see now we get texture on top of this brick material. So now if you want color, you can either use a brick texture in here or use a concrete texture. Concrete as an overlay is a good way to balance it and customize it within Max rather than go into Photoshop and paint brick textures that you might want to see. So if you go to composite material, you tell it to keep this concrete map. It's going to keep, this basically acts as Photoshop layers more or less, so it works the same as you do in Photoshop. So you can add a new layer here. You can move these layers around however you want, just like in Photoshop. So this is our concrete texture that we just made. Let me name it so that we can and then this, I'm going to do a V-Ray color so that we can just control the color very easily, literally just within our color picker here. So same thing I did within the tiles map, but using a V-Ray color, we're going to get a very accurate material to render ratio. So if you set this to, currently it's set to normal mode, so there's no blending mode set, so we're just seeing this concrete texture. If you set it to multiply, it's going to multiply on top of your color that is set below it, or overlay, whatever suits your need at the time. So you go up one level in your material, you'll see now we're getting both the concrete and, I'm going to lessen this so you can see it a little better. So you're getting the concrete texture and the color texture in the material. So let's render this out. So now we're getting a nice procedural texture with lots of resolution. What's this, Jeff? Should I close it? The computer's overloaded. Just leave it. Would you like to hide? No. All right, so you can see now we have a lot of resolution in our texture, and it's fully customizable. If you need to adjust the variance, you don't have to go into Photoshop and one by one lighten bricks and remove shadows and all that stuff that takes a lot of time. I'm not saying it's a bad way to do this. If you have the proper amount of time, it's good to go into Photoshop and customize your textures. This is just another way to do so. And we can use this map for our reflection and for our bump as well, or displacement. So if I drag this into our reflection slot, let's copy it because we're going to change it. Let's adjust the blur value of our material. So this go in here. So we want a black and white version of what we just did for our spec map. So if we go back into the composite, set this to normal, remove this, we have our black and white material again, which is going to give us variation in our reflections. On top of this material, get rid of this. You can do a color correction to get more contrast out of this. So that when we're rendering, we're getting more variation in our whites to blacks on the brick texture. So you can see here, what we just did is breaking up the reflections a little bit. So in reality, the bricks aren't perfectly smooth and perfectly even reflections all over the place. So this adds a little bit of realism to the texture itself. Our grout should probably not be reflective. So let's make this black. So now you can see the grout's not reflecting, the brick is reflecting. So if we hit render here, it should pick up highlights. Mainly on the right side. I'm going to adjust the scale of this real quick. All right, so I'm going to bump this back up. We're not getting a lot of reflection out of it, so I'm just going to overdo it a little bit. There you go. So you can see where our map is affecting the bricks, and now that we're getting reflection, it's reflecting the plane lights that I have in this scene. So wherever you have sun set up in your scene, you're going to get highlight points on your bricks. You're going to get a little more realism to your texture overall without having to worry about painting it in Photoshop later. And one more use for this tiles map, you can start with your reflection map. If you copy this or just drag it into your Fury displacement mod, you drag it into the texture maps and you copy it. Drag this back into our editor as an instance so we can edit it. Leaving 2D mapping on for most scenes, architectural scenes, is the fastest way to use displacement, and I wouldn't recommend using it on all your surfaces. Only things up close or if it's actually needed. I just wanted to show you how you can use the tiles map to get a clean, actually displaced geometry. So if we go back in here, we don't necessarily need the concrete texture on our map anymore for the displacement. We just want a black and white version for the height of our bricks. If you open this, you can see what it's going to do. So more variation. Black is your low point, white is your high point. So these are variations in brick height, more or less. So if we do this at 0.25, we'll get a little variation, but not much. If I hit render, should have displaced bricks. Oh. So now you can see you're getting shadows and you're getting the light is affecting your geometry. Again, this is all personal preference. If you have time and you have the need for displacement, then this is a great way to get a clean displacement map while using one map throughout your whole material. So using the same technique, I'm going to show you how to do metal panel. I won't spend as much time on that unless anybody has questions about this. All right, so this is set up the same way we just did the brick. Let me render it for you. So in the Atlanta project in particular, we had a lot of metal panel. So this is a great way to get that done very fast and accurately. All right, so basic setup here, using the tiles map in our reflection and our diffuse slot. And I had displacement on this as well, just to emphasize these joint lines. A lot of times you'll get geometry and it actually is modeled for you, so you won't need to displace it, but you might want these tiles to break it up in particular patterns. So using a fall off here, is a good way to get variation on the metal edges, kind of give you a softer metal for more organic surfaces. Let me change the color to show you how it's working. So if you turn your fall off type to Fresnel, so if you turn your fall-off type to Fresnel, basically it's acting as a Fresnel material. It's giving you your main color, your top, your front, and your side. Your main color is what you're looking at, so it's a viewing angle thing, and then the edges are catching the light or acting as your fall-off. So a lot of times with metal material, you want a specific gray color to be majority of the metal, but you want to emphasize the edges and the color of the light hitting it. So if you use a yellow or a lighter color of your predominant color here at the top, it'll give you a nice highlight, basically fake around your edge. So it's kind of a trick to getting more realistic metals on your scene without adding point lights and fill lights and all kinds of lights to achieve that on certain surfaces. Yeah, so it's set up basically the same way as the brick material. If anybody has any questions, I can run through this again. Otherwise, I'll move on to the next thing. So using the distance text is a big thing with setting up roads for animations in particular, but it's also useful for still images because it's fully, you don't have to unwrap your surface. It's fully customizable with geometry in your scene without taking it out into Photoshop and painting again. It's kind of managing your materials within Max without going elsewhere too much. So what this material does is it's actually a map for your textures. So it acts as a diffuse map or a reflection map, or it's a map within your texture. So if I start a new material here, for instance, I want to put the distance text in my diffuse slot, and it's controlled by the geometry in our scene. So let me show you the rendered version of this to kind of better explain it. So all of this is created based on maps and this geometry that you're seeing here. So the road lines, the tire marks, the yellow lines on the side are all rendered in. You can control the sharpness of your map, to, just like I showed you with the tiles map, so you don't lose detail in the distance. When you're animating, you don't get flickering from really fine lines in your scene. Normally, if you have geometry for road lines and you're animating it, you'll get a lot of flicker and shimmer in fine objects. So you have to play with your AA and stuff to fix it, but this eliminates all of that within your map. So the setup process, like I said, is starting with this distance text in your map slot or in your diffuse slot. We want to, we'll start with these middle road lines first. So if I put this on my road, it's going to render white because that's what color we have this map set to. And I have all these objects as my reference points set to not be renderable to the camera because we don't need to see the actual geometry. It's just there as a point to affect our material. So you have to add these, these objects within the distance text objects at the bottom of the material. So you can either select it through your list or just click on it. So now if I hit render, you can see how it's affecting this material that we have set up. So then currently I have inside separate check. This is how it comes by default. 10 inches is the default radius off of your object that it gives you. So if I put this at 2 feet, you can see how it changes the effect of this material. For road lines, if you check inside solid, and then we change this inside solid color, it's going to give us, it's going to fill the shape of the object in our scene. So this shape right here will be filled with this yellow color that I just assigned. So automatically you have a road line on your road geometry. Your base texture, you can set this up as far as a composite material goes. Again, we're going to create our base texture here, which would be our asphalt. And then we're going to multiply these road lines or screen them or however you want to set this up. Right now we're using, let's switch this to white, and then we'll screen this on top. And then when we hit render, we should have, oops, we should have a material. All right, screen. Oh. So the reason this isn't working is because my far color is set to white. So if we put this at black, when you screen, you probably all know this, screen mode uses the lighter colors to, they'll be visible on your screen. So if you set this to black, it's going to be not visible. So we'll screen the lines on top. We should see our asphalt with one road line in the center. So if we want to add the rest of the geometry that we have set up, so all these road lines, we just add them down here again in this box, all these boxes. You hit render. So now we have our road set up with the basic lines. To add detail to this, you can use this distance text to get dirt around the objects, more or less, so like wear and tear off the side of the road from cars driving by, just as an added detail. So if I do a new distance text as another layer, and we pick these side objects, for instance, Make a selection. So this one we want to basically occlude, add an occlusion of dirt around these objects. So we're going to use this object as a reference point. So we have these two objects selected, these side objects. We don't need the inside color anymore because we're not filling this object with a color. So we want to use this far color as our dirt. So I'm going to set it to red so you can see what's going on. Set this at 2 feet. And then I'm going to multiply it. So that didn't work because it's not the far color that we want. It's the near color that we want. So it's near to our object, not far from our object. So you can see now we're getting this red color at the object edge. So it's wherever the object ends, it's not going to be inside the object. So it's keeping the white line that we made for our road lines. And it's giving us this 2-foot radius of dirt from the edge. So you can select all your other lines in your scene. Hit render, and it'll affect all the geometry that we just selected. So again, a lot of times you get geometry from a client that's already set up. They might have road lines from AutoCAD, or they might have road geometry already in there for you. This is just a quick way to utilize that without UV mapping every single road line in your scene, unwrapping things. For the aerial on this project, we did unwrap the road texture, and Keely will talk to that when we get to that. But this is just a procedural way to get a lot of resolution out of your texture and detail at the same time. Okay. So one last material thing I wanted to go over is the override material. So I had this small room set up just to show you how color bleed works, if you don't already know. You have a tiny scene with a big green surface. You're going to get a lot of green bouncing in your scene. Sometimes for clients this is a problem because they want to see a white surface, or you want to see the color actually how it is, just for a visual purpose. It's not that important to show color bleed at all times. This is something you can bring back in post as well. So this material, and as well, if you have a dark color, it's not going to bounce light as well as your white override material. So when we set up the scene earlier, we were using a clay override, so our light is bouncing pretty well in our scene because we're just using a white material, so it's bouncing everywhere and it's super reflective. As soon as we add a darker color to our scene, our scene just gets darker and our exposure gets screwed up, and we kind of have to rethink our material versus light versus camera settings. So this is kind of a nice way to balance that and not have to worry about all those settings once you start setting up materials in your scene. So the way it works is this is my, let's say this is my pink material. You wrap it in a V-Ray override material. So once you do that, just tell it to keep your old material as a sub-material. I'm going to create a new one here. So we have this basic red material. We're going to wrap it in the override material. And we have these options to override these these settings within the material. So we can override the GI color, the reflective material, the refractive material, and the shadow. For the purposes of this material or this example, I'm just going to show you the GI override for lighting. So if you drag this in here, before I'll render it as is. So right now we're getting all this red color bleed. Okay, I'm not supposed to talk while it's rendering, sorry. So you're getting all this red color bleed in our scene, which is not very flattering. Nobody's going to want to see that. So if we set another V-Ray material within this override, GI override slot, whatever this color is what it's going to bounce in the scene. So we can take it back to what we had, a white material in our scene. And our scene's not going to reflect this, this red material, and it's going to give us a lot of light bounce. So if you do want some color bounce for realism, you can kind of meet in the middle. Do a lighter red material.
And I think it's also worth, oops, sorry. It's worth mentioning that sometimes we do want color bleed, obviously, but we do that in post typically, and we'll be going through color bleeding in post-production. Right.
So this is kind of a good middle ground for lighting, exposure, and getting some natural color bleed off your materials. Again, these overrides here, if you don't want your base material to bounce reflections, or if the reflection value of this material is, if it's super reflective, it's going to bounce more light. If you don't want it to bounce that much light once you make it reflective, you can override that here in this reflection slot. Same with refraction, same with shadow colors. And that's pretty much all I got for materials. If anybody has any questions before I move on to proxies and force pack.
Just very quickly, how do you share your material libraries? Do you just save as material libraries? Or?
There's that's a good question. There's a few ways to do it. Again, like you said, you can save to a custom material library. So this right here, if you go into your material browser, you can create new libraries within here per project or per person or per team that you're working with. And you can add all your materials to that custom library. That way, so people can open just that library if it's in your project folder and pick the material that you already set up. Otherwise, you can use XRF objects in a scene as another way to do it. So if you create like a dummy scene with spheres or some kind of base geometry in it, you apply your materials to that. They can XRF that object and pull the material off of that and use that. The one caveat with that is that you can't use, it doesn't hold modifier information, so you can't use like the same UVs, you can't pull all that information from it. As well as it shows up as an XRF object material. So I think the best practice is to stick with creating a library and just letting your team know where it's at. All right, so I'm going to go into force pack stuff. I've got a few things here. I've got an interior scene set up with using splines to scatter people in seats for large scenes. And an exterior scene with people on surfaces, stairs, as well as plants and trees along a spline. And I'm going to go through some proxy setup as well. So setting up your geometry as proxies properly before you use force pack. So let's. Does everybody know what force pack is, first of all? Yes?
Everybody already uses it?
All right. So these are the 3 things to remember when you're using Forest Pack, because when you're using Forest Pack, you end up with a billion objects in your scene. It's easy to overload your scene if you're not using proxies, and a lot of times people will jump into Forest Pack and not do this, and then when the next person goes to open it or render it, they're running out of memory or they can't use the file because you have a million mesh objects with 50,000 polys each, you know. So the main things to remember here are center your pivots on your objects before you start. If you go up here to the hierarchy tab, you can adjust your pivots manually. Just move it around here. Or you can center it to the object. Here you can center it to align to the object, or you can align to world. Normally just center to the object, turn this off, and your pivot is now perfectly centered on this geometry. For this instance, we want people sitting in seats along splines, so their pivot point should be wherever you want this object to sit on the ground. So we're going to want the pivot point at their bum. So let's go to this put pivot script is a good script Neil Blevins wrote. Basically this thing acts, it shows you the pivot points on your geometry. So if I hit here, this is another way to center it. It'll center to your object. This will put it at the base. So for plants and trees, I'll go over that in a second. We always want our pivot at the base of the object. But let's recenter it here. So now we want our pivot point. These people are sitting, so we want our pivot point where they're going to be sitting. So let's move this pivot point more or less where we need it. So this could take some guesswork once you get them in the seats or once you get them on the spline that you want. If they don't look like they're sitting in the right spot, you can literally just move your pivot point in your proxy or your mesh, and it'll adjust within Forest Pack. So we have our pivot point set up. This object's ready to be made a V-Ray proxy. So if you right click and you go to V-Ray mesh export, you can pick your directory where you need it to go. So just gonna save it here. Name your mesh whatever you want to call it, man, sitting. And check automatically create proxies. So this is going to take this mesh and convert it to a proxy within our scene. If you don't check this, it's going to export the proxy as a mesh where we just saved it, but it's going to keep this guy just how he is as a poly object or a mesh object. So if you create proxies, he's now a proxy in our scene. So you can go to the modify tab just to double check. This is where you can load your proxies. If for instance you have a guy sitting, you want a woman sitting, you can replace them within this browse option. All your preview options are here, just like you have in your mesh. So when you're instancing or when you're scattering objects that are proxies, it's important to remember to use instances. If you're using copies, it's basically there's no point in creating this proxy because it's duplicating all the geometry that you just converted to a proxy. So if you're using instance, it's pulling from this one proxy file that we saved out. So it's saving memory and it's saving, it's basically just going to make your file run faster when you're working in it. So now we have this proxy. Normally I'll save this file out with all these proxies in an assets folder to share with people, and you can go into your Forest Pack setup. So I have this quick scene set up for, say it's our stadium interior. We would run these splines along our seat edges or wherever we want these people to sit, and it's important to remember where you're putting vertex points. You can control the Forest Pack on vertex points, or you can control it along the spline using basically a distance between each object. So if we set up our Forest Pack, click this spline right here. this a little wider. So let's merge in our geometry, our proxies. So we have this geometry. These aren't proxied, but they'll work the exact same ways if they were proxied. So I'm going to show you just using these meshes. So if you choose a spline as your surface, you don't get a spline as a surface in ForcePack won't scatter on a Z. It won't give you variation in height. It won't follow a spline, basically. So we're going to want to go into the tree editor. I'm going to do a custom edit. And then you want to add this path right here, creation tools along a path. And then we want to remove it because by default, when you create that ForcePack object, it puts a surface. Let's see. Oops. Oh, I'm going to hit create. There we go. So now we're getting the scatter along all our splines, whether or not these splines are multiple splines or a single spline. And we can adjust, if you do it in vertex positions, like I was saying, and you build your spline along your seats, it will put these evenly at the vertex points. If you want to do it with spacing, and you know the exact spacing of all your seats, so 4 feet, it's basically setting up. Let me add the people. There we go. So now we have our people on this spline, and they're sitting 4 feet apart. Let's go to tree editor again. Set this at 2 feet. If you hit create, it'll put them at 2 feet, and it will randomly distribute based on. If you come into your geometry here, you can tell it. So if you have too many of this guy, you can turn down the probability of him. If you hit create, it updates it so that this guy won't be seen as many times in your ForcePack object. And to randomize it even more, once you get your people on the correct pivots or the vertex points in your stadium setup or wherever you're scattering your people, if you go to transform and you turn on rotation and you turn on scale, it's going to randomly, it's kind of hard to see here with the cloud. See how it's like it's randomly rotating and it's randomly scaling our people within the scene. So we probably don't want the rotation on unless it's very slightly adjusting it. So what this is doing is only giving us a 45-degree variation between the person. Everybody should be facing forward, so probably just leave this at, actually leave it off. And scale will give you a variation in the size of the people in your scene. Let's see. So with this object that we're creating to scatter objects, it's important to keep your pivot point wherever you want your the people to look or the object to look, so you can have it face, the ForcePack object face this pivot point. So I'll go to this completed file. So you can see wherever my pivot point is on this base spline, these people are going to look at it. So they're all facing the right direction. And you tell that to happen by this distribute number right here, or this distribute checkbox. So if you tell it pivot, it's going to face the pivot. If you tell it centers, it's going to face the center of the object proxy itself. So that's basically it on the people setup. It's very simple. It's just the setup time with getting these splines that takes a while, but once you get the spline and your overall scene set up, you should be good to go to scatter your objects. Any questions? So this one I'm going to go over scattering plants and people on surfaces rather than splines for the exterior scene, as well as a tree line that we have here along our road that bends and conforms with the road geometry. So there's a lot of stuff that would have needed to be painted in Photoshop if we didn't have Forest Pack here, specifically people and just planting in general. If the client has very specific plant layouts, it's good to use splines with Forest Pack to give boundaries and create custom planting areas. And with these, I've just used some dummy geometry so it's easier to read in the viewport. But with these people, there's a lot of people in like particular areas that we wanted. So this is all public space. This is that area with the parking lot with trucks and the tailgating happening, a lot of activity. So once we get this set up, or once we get an idea of where we want people, where we want things happening in our scene, we'll go in and we'll take the geometry. For instance, we want these sidewalks. So I wanted the sidewalk geometry to be my base geometry for my scatter. So I came in and I detached random surfaces where I want the people to be scattered. So these steps, obviously I don't want people everywhere, so it's good to break it up this way. Detach it as a separate surface. Normally name it as the surface that you want so it's easy to find in your scene. Use this Forest Pack on that surface that we created. So you can see the people are only being scattered on these objects that I just detached. So once you get your Forest Pack set up on that object, you add your geometry within the Geometry tab. You can exclude areas, for instance, if you have people running through the skin of this building. So I have people cutting through the inside of this building that we don't want that to happen. So if I make a spline in these areas, I'll just do a large area to show you. This is going to be our exclusion spline. So basically it's going to remove people from a specific area where we don't want them. Create this. Click on the spline, tell it to exclude. It's going to automatically remove people or whatever we have. If we had plants there, it would do the same thing. It removes them from within this spline. When you're using a surface, you can't include in a spline and have a surface as your same scatter surface. So it either has to be a poly or a spline setup. So this exclusion only works. Or it only works as an exclusion, not an inclusion. So you can see here, this doesn't do anything if I move this spline around. It's not going to add objects to it. But it will exclude objects. And again, you can come in here, turn on your random rotation. What this does is just makes it a little more natural within your scene. makes the people randomize, gives you more variation. Scale, not everybody's the same height, so give them a random scale. And then from your camera, you get more variation in your people. Yep. So same setup with the plants. So I've created some boxes, gave it a surface just like we did with the people. You can give it a probability. So if I don't want to see as many of this blue proxy, you can turn it all the way off if you want, or you can turn it up to 100%, less of this purple object. And the key to natural looking plants is using this clusters option. So you can set your distribution map. There's all these default ones, or you can load a custom map. If you have a specific planting plan, you can either paint a black and white map of your own, or just use these default ones. So this one puts it in a grid. Full is basically just a really dense area. And you can use this unit slider. A lot of times when you first get into forest pack, you don't know what setting adjusts the density of your plants or your people. This unit slider right here is exactly where you do that. So the lower the value, the more dense your object's going to get. The higher the value, the more spaced out they're going to get. So let's put this at 50. So normally it's by default it's on random. So if you have multiple proxies in your geometry list like we set up here, it's just going to mix them all together. That's where this map comes into play. If you do a custom map, see vertical bands. So you can see this map up here. It's using the white points as our scatter points and the black points as the exclusion points. So if you don't use a custom map and you just want some nice variation, you can set it to full and you turn clusters on. And clusters basically groups your plants into natural looking formations. So if I up the scale of this, you can kind of see what it's doing. It's creating a pattern, creating some variation without being too specific. So from perspective, you get a more natural breakup of the plants. If you turn it on random, it just looks like a big mess of things together. So if you turn this on, the settings in here are pretty simple. This is your size of your clusters. This is the roughness value of the cluster, so it's the actual shape of the cluster. So if you turn this up, you can kind of see how it's giving the shape of the cluster more points. We'll smooth it out. Blurry edge kind of blends the clusters together, so you can see how it's kind of blending to make a more natural edge to the proxies. See the purple and the blue here kind of blend together now. And the noise controls how much this blurry edge is going to blend into each other. So this blurry edge is going to kind of blend them all together. This is going to kind of spread in further. So we're getting some of the proxies within the other proxies further in that cluster shape. And that's usually as far as we take the plants, forest pack plants. Right. So an important thing to think about when you're setting up plants and people and forest pack objects is putting them on their own layers. So I have these forest pack force pack layers set up where I can just turn these things off. So when you have to re-render certain things, you don't have to re-render these plants, and you don't have to re-render these people, and you already have an element set up so you can blend them in Photoshop if there's a last second change. So if you right click on these this force pack object and give it a gbuffer ID, when we go to render this, if we add an element here, we match these IDs to what we just created, it's basically going to give you a render element. So you can pull that object out of the region. Is there a question?
Yeah, there's a question online here. It says, can you distribute the trees according to maps? Example, red, green, blue, yellow, each having a specific model using bitmaps or another method to control the shape of the distribution?
If I understand correctly, that's what I was just showing with the this distribution map right here. So you can load a custom map. I'll make one really quick to show you. So this map is going to control where we're scattering objects. So if you go back into Max, into our forest object, close this, distribution map, bitmap, forest pack. Well, let's load this in. You can see that it's using that map to actually scatter our objects, and if we adjust the units, it's going to scale it to our scene. So it's only scattering on that map that we just created in Photoshop. Does that answer the question? Good. Okay.
He said he means the diversity tab if you wanted to display flowers according to color.
The diversity tab. Yeah, so you can use color IDs. I haven't used this much, to be honest. But the way it works is, yeah, you use RGB values to scatter on it with a map. I don't want to get too into it just because I haven't done much with it. But basically, if you're getting to that point, it's either very random or very specific. So we can create, the client might have very specific shapes that they want in their landscape, in their landscape plan, sorry. So we'd take this, sorry. Make these splines. So if they gave us a landscape plan or CAD plan, we'd pick out the splines, close all the splines, weld the splines, and create the shape that we need to scatter in. If there's specific plant types to areas that need to be shown in the rendering or according to the plan, you can add these inclusion objects. So you need to turn off, we're scattering within a spline, so we need to turn off the surface object for it to actually show up. Within this area. So Oh, it's because I have this distribution map. There we go. It's because I had the map in the distribution map in this slot, so it wasn't allowing it to be seen. But if you need to scatter certain objects in here, you're going to have to make multiple force pack objects and use it per spline. So like if this is one plant type, this spline here, you would have a force pack with that type of plant, and then you would do it the same thing with this. So we break it up by specific plant type or landscape line. That's pretty much all I got.
Can I ask a question about how you handle the variation in people so that you don't see the same people over and over?
Yeah, so that's in the probability that I was showing. So the more objects you add to your force pack object, the more variation you're going to get. So in the geometry here, or the geometry rollout, I've added probably 10 different proxies. So if you add 30 proxies in here, that's going to give you more variation naturally. But if you set the probability pretty low on these guys, you're going to get more variation that way as well. So it's just going to break up how much and how often you're seeing certain proxies. And that's where you would control. It's basically from the get-go, the more you have in here, the more variation that you're going to get on the proxies that you see in your scene, as well as the density. It's kind of finding the middle ground that you like. So if less dense, it's going to scatter people and you're going to see less repetition. Did that answer your question?
Yep. I was just wondering if maybe you also had another technique of maybe doing a randomized material or something on the textures itself. Because you can only have so many people models, I guess.
Right.
So.
Again, I haven't used that much or had success with it. There's a force pack material. Yeah, I don't know the proper way to use this, to be honest. I haven't done much with this just because if it's a still, we just rely on it in Photoshop to add some variation. Normally you'll take these proxies and paint a crowd texture on top of them or add variation in light and shadow and all that within Photoshop.
For this job, we actually had they were wearing red or jerseys that were quite specific. I mean, we're seeing them at a distance, but we actually went in and went through the trouble of creating a certain number of assets that had the exact sort of jerseys on, so we could reuse them and reuse them. So it allowed us to be a little bit less, I'd say, random. So we saw some of those people, but we're always from a distance, so what you really got was the sense of the red.
And so to kind of indirectly answer your question, but kind of answer your question, this is the force pack material is where you would do that. It has a bunch of features built in. You can do it by map channel. If you randomize your IDs, there's scripts that'll give all these objects random IDs. You can use this force pack material to randomly change hue, change color, change all that stuff within the force pack material. I just don't know the specifics behind it, so I'd hate to give you the wrong direction. All right.
One question about the forest pack when you create vegetations. It's there's a way to control the forest objects when they are on the edge of the spline. For example, sometimes the objects are outside of the splines.
Right. Yeah, there's
I don't know if like a fall off from the spline going inside of the forest area.
Yeah, there are fall off settings within here. So let me select this spline that I made earlier. So this thing's scattering currently just over the edge of our circle that or the spline that we created. So if you go to your, let me see where it is. Sorry, I get lost in all these rollouts. And areas. So there's a fall off number here. Oops, that's not it. So you can adjust the scale. Let me see. There you go. So there's multiple ways to do this. You can adjust the fall off overall, where it'll exclude towards the edge, or you can adjust the scale, which sometimes fixes things like if you're using grass or plants and they're scattering through your curb objects or walls. You can just simply adjust the scale so that you have smaller objects towards the edge of your spline boundary, and it won't cut through objects as much, or the density overall. So that the higher the number we go on this, it's just going to kind of bring our fall off in further. And that's under, if you're using a spline, it's under areas. And then fall off, you just have to turn it on to affect the density or turn it on to affect the scale.
I had a question on what plugin you use to animate ForcePack. Like, do you use X level, Grow, or anything like that?
A lot of just keyframing.
We don't usually use any plugins to animate the forest pack objects. No.
Right, just keyframing your trees. Like if you have a tree that's blowing in the wind, animate it before you bring it in and make it a proxy, and then use it in your forest pack object, and it holds the animation values. Any other questions?
Yeah, there's a couple questions online here. Says, can you describe the method the method of preset usage in Forest Pack?
Presets? I don't think so. There are presets here. So you can save out all your, we don't necessarily do this just because per job it's kind of different, but if you have a generic sort of setup that you like to start with, for instance, I guess one thing that I always do is set this to full when I'm doing plants. So this distribution map, all these settings within your distribution map, a good starting point, you could save it as a preset here. Let me try it out. So it's going to save all your parameters within your forest pack setting. And then you can import wherever you saved it to your desktop or in your project folder. So yeah, you can use presets.
And there's one other question too. It says, I've never used Forest Pack, but when using the custom distribution map, how do you control the UVW mapping of the distribution map?
That was this density, the units here. It's kind of an arbitrary number as far as scene scale goes. The lower that you go with this value, the more dense it's going to make your objects. The higher that you go, it's going to give you more space in between your objects. So that's normally how you control the UVs of your objects. You can also change, if you're using a surface, not a spline. Right here I'm using a spline. So these people are scattered on a surface. You can tell it to use the UVs. So when you adjust your UVs on that surface underneath, it's going to adjust the density of your people.
There's a clarification here. He said he meant more when you're using Forest Pack Pro for distribution, how do you control the repetition of Forest Pack Pro or size for the planting?
So like the scale and the rotation and stuff like that? Is that what that?
If you just want to type in your question or clarify what you were asking there. The Forest Pack Pro texture map he used for distribution, he says.
Oh, how do you randomize using that texture map? What he was asking?
Just hang on here. Backplane. So he says backplane Forest Pack Pro typed in white. Not sure what.
I'm not sure I understand the question, but to use the map, you load it within this map slot in the distribution map. You click this, click bitmap. You can load that through here. So again, now it's using the map that we created. And for variation in size and scale and stuff, all that stuff is in the transform rollout. So your scale, you have to enable it. Rotation, translation is going to move your objects left and right. So all this combined kind of gives you a variation as far as object size, scale, and all that stuff. All right.
Can ForestPack use animated people?
Yeah, ForestPack holds animation data, and proxies do as well. So you can have an animated proxy loaded in here, and it'll work the same exact way as I'm showing you with these dummy objects. So that's what we were saying with trees. If you're animating trees, you do all that up front before you make it a proxy. Set your pivot points up, make it a proxy, and then load it into ForestPack. I'm going to go to PDF.
So at the end of our work in progress 2, we sent out, these are the renderings we sent out. So we have basic sense of where the textures are occurring, basic sense of what we have in terms of lighting. And then for this shot, we actually didn't include the people. We wanted to make sure that we were on point with the textures for the bowl, and the field was looking right. You can show the field, this texture.
Oh yeah, so I can go back to the using the distance text to set up the field. I don't have this already set up, but it should be fairly quick to run through with you.
Yeah, the field was a really important aspect, obviously, of this image, getting it to look right.
So the same way we did the road texture, I'm going to set up the field graphics and hope it works. I think it'll work. The same way we did this using geometry and the distance text. So I'm going to grab this stuff. Don't need that. All right, so say we got all this geometry from the client, and we don't want to render it because we don't want the actual letters or graphics to have depth, and we want it to look painted on the grass object itself. Let's save this out. All right, so start with a new material. This will be our grass material. And then we want to ungroup this. All right, so we're going to take both of these objects and this grass, and we're going to project it onto the grass texture. So the key to the distance text that I didn't mention before is that it needs to be cutting through your object. So basically this base object or base material, this object has to be interacting with it to actually affect the material. So this has a shell on it, so we can kind of overdo the shell so you can see it's going through both sides. We're going to create our distance text in the diffuse slot. I'm going to pick our material, or our object that we want, which is this falcon symbol. You can kind of see in the material editor, it's showing the geometry. We're not actually going to see this geometry in our viewport, because we're going to make it not renderable. And we hit oh, did I make the wrong object not visible? Yes, I did. So now we have our reference object rendering on this material. But we want to make it look painted on, so we're going to use the inside solid color, which is a red, and the near color, which will be the blend off the edge of the near edges of this object, as a red as well. Do it at like 1 foot. So now basically we're getting a projection of that shape onto our geometry. So any texture you put below that, for instance grass, this will be our grass texture. If I have a grass texture on here. Well, I'm just going to go ahead and, all right. So we have some grass. So this is not showing up because our blending modes aren't set. So if we put this to multiply, we should get this projection on the grass texture. So one other thing to remember when you're using this is that often if you get, so if I have this same material on this, see it'll tell you have a dependency loop. These reference objects have to have a separate object than the base object that we're projecting on. So it can't have the same grass texture, it won't render this shape itself. So a lot of times we'll just put a generic material on it just to make sure that we don't have that dependency loop error popping up. So from our camera, so now we'll take this other object, do the same exact thing we just did with the inside of the logo. make sure it's breaking the surface. Give it a generic object so we don't get that dependency loop. Add a new distance text. Add this geometry that we want for the outside color. And screen it since it's white. We should. So the reason this isn't working is because it's in our layers, it's on top, the white is on top of the red. So if we just reverse these colors, it should work. So now you're getting the projection of the objects on your surface. And if you want to see through it, and so it's not solid, you can adjust the opacity of these guys. And obviously you have to play with the blending modes because that's what's happening here. The red is going away because it's multiplying on top of this white color at only half the visibility. And then you can adjust the spread. Spread on these guys to kind of make it more natural from up here. So that's how that works. And again, if you're animating a scene like this and you have all these, you can do the same thing with your lines, the yard lines and all these fine lines inside of here. But if you're animating it with this geometry in here, you're going to get some flicker as the lines get closer together, further away from the camera. If you're projecting it using this distance text, you won't get flicker at all.
So I'll just run through, again, the work in progress 2 images. These were all sent out at more draft render settings, again, half resolution. So we don't do our final render settings until we get our comments back from this phase. So this is, again, the exterior view, basic. We do a very basic color grading at this stage, just to give the overall impression. Notice the lines on the road are very, very much draft, and we have some of the forest pack objects in there. All of the cars were done with prize proxies, and then the aerial, again, very much draft process at this point with very basic color grading, some very basic effects just to convey what the ideas are. And then this is what we'll get back at this stage. So a lot of very specific feedback that if we had gone ahead and done a full resolution render, we'd have to kind of waste a lot of time redoing that. So we're focusing a lot of our attentions in how to move into post more quickly. So by doing draft render settings, we can pick these up, send out our final renders, and as I say, get into post. There was a lot of very specific feedback as to the logo and the branding. It had to be very clear. And so using that distance text was really useful for us. We could get in there and modify it quickly, get back out. We didn't have to recreate any geometry there. And then again, the aerial, lots of very specific feedback on the context buildings. We weren't given a context model, so we had to create all of this using a lot of Google Earth models, whatever we could get. And then just painting. So there's a lot of painting. And as you can see, the vegetation was evolving. So rendering the trees separately allowed us a lot of flexibility. We could get in post-production and replace that tree layer with the accurate landscape plan. So once we pick up these changes, so changes to the identity, geometry changes, any changes to the building, at this point we actually received a whole new building model. And so we updated the entire model. And then we proceeded to send out our final renders. And Freddie's going to discuss the passes that we're using once we get into post-production, what we require. It's different usually per image, but we know what our workflow is going to be. We know what we need. And then the final render settings that we would use on a project like this.
All right, after Jason explained how we work these files through textures, camera modes, the lighting setup, we're going to talk quickly about how we work the work in progress settings and the final settings of our files. I'm just going to reset this file. We're not going to get into rendering process. We're just going to somehow like explain the main aspects of how lighting works, how subdivision affect the rendering time, and how we can manage to use low samples and get a really high quality render. So in here, if we see the settings of the V-Ray, all right, just gonna set up. All right, in V-Ray, basically how lighting works is through an indirect illumination. So what we have to be clear is like our primary and secondary bounces are fast enough to produce images. So we usually go for an irradiance map for primary bounces, and a secondary bounces we use light catch. Brute force is a really good one, but it definitely increases rendering times twice or 3 times because it gets really accurate in darker corners of the geometry. So we usually go for light catch. So getting into the irradiance map, basically V-Ray has some presets for manipulating the first bounces, the primary bounces of light through the scene. So we're gonna find the custom, very low, low, medium, medium animation, high, and the rest. So basically what we do is to go for a very low settings. I'm just going to explain quickly what this means in here in the basic parameters and the options. So basically the basic parameters, as soon as we start using the presets that V-Ray give us, the mean rate and the maximum rate, the closest these values get to 0, the more quality we're going to have in our lighting samples. So if I start switching, you're going to see that it'll start changing. And it'll start getting closer to 0. So in here, usually what we do in scenes that requires many lights, and it probably going to have effects of artifacts or dark areas in the rendering splotchiness. We gotta play carefully with the hemisphere subdivisions and the interpolation samples. So as Jason was explaining before, these settings will definitely increase our rendering time. So for the work in progress 0.1 or 0.2, we don't need to use high values of these subdivisions. So we usually could get from 60 to 20. And these values should be farther from 0.
So basically what those two numbers do is they're giving it a window of so it's giving it a window of samples. So the min rate and the max rate is how far in between those two numbers it's going to look to sample your image. So the closer you get those numbers, the less your lighting quality is going to vary over the entire image. So if you have a wide range, it's going to render much faster. So if you have a negative value and a positive value, or two negative values, sorry, we're below 0, so it's going to get less definition in between those two numbers. And if you go to a high value, right, so now it's looking for more samples in between each number. And that's not looking, see here is -1, -1. It's going to render at that sample rate, so it's not going to look in between any number. So you're going to get a defined definition in your lighting.
All right, so for the work in progress 01, we go for really low settings in the minimum rate and maximum rate, and we also use the hemispheric subdivisions, just like almost like the preset that Max brings, which is like 50 and 20 in the interpolation sample. So we just like raise these values a little bit higher, from 60 to 20, 60 to 30. If we want to start enhancing somehow the lighting and the bounces, the primary bounces start getting definition in the corners of an object, we just start like switching off this option, which is the detail enhancement. And we can start like playing, making the radius smaller, so it will start adding more definition to the primary bounces. So let's jump into the light catch, which are the secondary bounces. So the first thing we have to be clear is like how many cores and threads our computer has. So let's say I'm gonna check quickly how many threads we got in this computer. I go to computer, right click, properties, go to device manager, and try to find where my processor is. I open this tab, and we'll find the number of threads I've got in my computer. So in this case, we got 12 threads. Let's close these windows. And the 12 threads, we're gonna place it in here, in the number of passes. So that's how we're gonna use the threads and cores our computer has. For the subdivisions, in the first work in progress, we just go for really low, as Jason was explaining before. We just go from 600 to 700. Because our rendering won't be bigger than 2.5K, I believe. Just gonna like change the size in here. So that's gonna be the size. Usually we go for 2K or 2.5, the half of the resolution of the final image. So obviously these calculations in the secondary bounces should be a low amount, because obviously that we don't need that high quality in this first work in progress. All right, just gonna create some lighting so we can understand how to manage lighting subdivisions against settings V-Ray DMC sampler. So let's say I got a V-Ray light in the scene. So the lighting, I'm just gonna add a V-Ray daylight system. All right. So let's say in our files we got a main light, which is the daylight system, and I got like a secondary lighting. So if we select the first lighting, we're gonna find that there are some subdivisions in shadows. So if you start increasing these subdivisions, the rendering time will start increasing twice or 3 times. It depends on how much I want to get definition in my shadows, if I want to make them diffuser or not, or if I want to make it sharper. If I select the V-Ray plane or a V-Ray light, and let's say in the interior shot we have 3 or more lights in that, we have like 20 lights. So each light has their own subdivision the standard that V-Ray brings those subdivision lights is 8 subdivisions. We usually go for 15 subdivisions if we are rendering a final image. Some artists, they go for 20 or for more, but definitely this value is going to change drastically the time and the efficiency of how we are rendering. So we just keep this as 13 or between 13 and 15.
Values of 8. Usually values of 8 are a good practice with these things. Like 8, 16, 24.
Open it.
So I was saying using values of 8 is a good practice there. 8, 16, or 24 subdivisions will usually kind of speed up your render time.
Well, that file is open. I'm just going to carry on explaining how we manage to have different lights and how we are going to start playing with the subdivisions of the DMC sampler. So basically, the DMC sampler controls the number of rays cast from the main lighting source and also the global subdivisions of all materials. So let's say I'm just going to open and create a new material. So in our scene, we have like a steel material, which is one of the materials that requires a lot of time for rendering, and it's like a high subdivisions in order to create a sharp reflection. So let's make this steel. We're just gonna change. So as soon as we start playing with the glossiness, we start seeing like there's some noise all over the material. So there are two ways we can improve that, like whether we change the subdivisions in here till 50 so that the noise will somehow disappear. But that's gonna make our rendering time really slow. We're gonna spend hours trying to get a render. And right now we're just trying to make the fastest settings possible. So what we try to do is keeping these settings, subdivisions to 16. So we keep these subdivisions into 16, but we're gonna start playing with the noise threshold and with the adaptive amount, minimum samples, and global subdivision multiplier. So the lower the value we get in here, the more rendering we're gonna spend, and the more accurate the noise control is gonna be. So as we are using low subdivisions in our materials, in our render, in our lights, like in here, we can start increasing, playing with this noise threshold, like going to 0.005, and increasing the number of minimal samples to 15. We can also try to multiply all the subdivision in the scene to 2.0. I would not recommend to use the samples much because that is going to increase the rendering time at least 3 times, but it's going to get a better result. So I just stick into one and I start playing with the number of rays and the minimum samples we got in here, and we got in the noise threshold. As well, the adaptive amount is how the reflectivity, the lighting is reflecting in materials and objects. So the closer I get to 0, the better quality I'm gonna have. So in this case, we can just like go to 0.75 or 0.65. I wouldn't go more than that. So that's basically how we manage to control lights against B-ray settings. So having clear in mind that we got primary, secondary bounces. Those primary and secondary bounces in the first work in progress should be really low settings with hemispheric subdivisions between 60 and 30, so you don't get artifacts on the scene. Low subdivisions in light catch, and playing with the DMC sampler. For the work in progress 02, I wouldn't use the 0.5 because it's just a work in progress. So we need faster rendering, so I'll just go for 0.1 or maybe 0.3. Just increase this to the default setup, which is 0.85, and keep this simple as just 10. That's for the work in progress 01 and work in progress 2. For the final setting, that's the one that you explained. It's 15, and we got a really low value in here, and changing the adaptive amount in here. This tab in here, the V-Ray system, is also really important when we have really heavy scenes. In the stadium, we have many proxies. We have the geometry of the stadium itself has many layers. So if the file is heavier than 1 million polygons, we gotta start changing our dynamic memory limit. So in this case, we got 4,000 megabytes. We also need to know how much memory RAM we got in the computer. So if we got 32 gigs of RAM, I'll go for half of the memory RAM in here. So the rendering time will be the system will be working without any problem. It won't be crashing, because that's what happens usually when you use proxies and when you use really heavy geometry scenes. The dynamic memory limit is really low, let's say like 2000, and you send the main render, but the software itself cannot handle that many objects in the scene, so you start crashing. So just go for the half or the 70% of your memory, RAM memory.
So basically, if you send a scene with not enough dynamic memory limit, it will sit there and unload geometry, and it won't render until all that geometry is unloaded. So by setting that higher, what Freddie's saying, that you're giving it a maximum limit, so it'll just load the scene all at once, and from there start rendering much quicker. Because if you have that at a low limit, it's just going to sit there and unload geometry. You'll see that's what it says. It says unloading geometry in the V-Ray message box. So that's a really important one. If you ever start using proxies or forest pack and your scenes are hanging and wondering why it's not rendering.
Right, let's get to this tab that is like how sharp our edges will look in the rendering. So we got the image sampler, which got 3 options. For the work in progress 0, 1, or 2, we use the fixed one with anti-aliasing, and the fixed image sampler is going to be just one subdivision. So it's going to be pretty straightforward, quick render. For final settings, we just go for an adaptive DMC sampler, which is going to work more accordingly with the V-Ray DMC sampler. We're just going to turn the anti-aliasing filter. And in here, depending on which filter we select, that's how the sharpness of the edges of the image is going to look. So we usually go for Kalman-Ram, or we go for Mitchell Network Valley. This one is more accurate with photography exposure. It's going to be more accurate to reality. If you want to get into really sharp edges, I would go for a Kalman-Ram. This definitely is going to make the sharpness of the whole image. So in here, in the adaptive DMC image sampler tab, this is the standard we keep for the work in progress 01 and 02 in order to have like a rendering time, fast rendering time. For the final images, we just start like increasing these amounts till 2, till 8. It depends on how the geometry of our objects are. It's a really complex scene, and we have many lines in the scene. and we need to get the definition of those lines without seeing that they start fading away. You start increasing these values, but definitely that's going to increase the render time twice or 3 times. So we just keep for this scene, we just kept it in 2 to 8 maximum subdivisions. Just gonna jump into the color mapping tab. This is more, it depends on how you set up your file, whether you are using the V-Ray frame buffer, or whether you are using the standard rendering window. So if we are using the V-Ray frame buffer, we have to make sure our gamma is going to be working in the max settings and in the V-Ray settings. So I'm just going to go to max, go to preferences, go to gamma, and make sure our gamma is in 2.20 and it is affecting the color selectors and the materials.
So in Max 2014, they got rid of the system gamma tab. You used to have more settings here. So there's a script on script spot that I just recently found. If you go to scripts folder, where you can adjust the output and the system gamma values. Scripts up top. So if you drag the gamma settings, drag up top, drag it into. Actually, I already installed it. Sorry. Yep, gamma settings. So this brings back those options. Basically, by default now, when you go to save your images out, it has an automatic gamma option. So if you go to common and act like you're going to save a JPEG out or something, right here. Save. So there's automatic and an override. A lot of times by default, it'll be on automatic, and it'll save out your files with the wrong gamma. So we've had instances where with 2014, we're sending animation frames and they all save really dark. That's because by default, you only have one option to adjust your gamma in the max settings now. So this gamma script, you can adjust the output. So when it goes to automatic, it'll be 2.2 or 1.0 or whatever you need. So if you set these to 2.2, both of them, and then you hit apply, wherever they put that setting, it'll adjust it for you, and it'll write it so that the automatic setting in that file save option is now 2.2.
Does that save with the file, or do you need to run that every time?
No, it'll save with the scene. So if you reset max and you open the scene, it'll ask you if you want to keep your gamma. So I just say keep scene gamma, and it'll stay at that. But it's a problem now because when you open a new max scene or someone opens your scene and they change it and they save it, it'll convert it back to saving it the wrong gamma. So, yeah.
Does that save that out to your machines as well?
No, it's a per scene thing. So
Can you repeat the question?
I was just,
Can you repeat the question?
If you're doing a network rendering, does that send the job out with those gamma settings?
So the question is.
Can you repeat the question,
yep,
Jason, so that it goes into
Yep, that's what the question is, if you send a network rendering job, does it save the gamma with that? And yeah, since it's a per scene adjustment, it'll save, when you save this scene and you submit to the network, basically the way that works is it archives the scene and then sends it to the network. So it saves all your settings from the scene and sends it to the network as well.
All right, getting back to color mapping, basically we got just basic settings. Like now that we got the gamma already set up, just gonna choose which type of filter we wanna use for understanding how light affects the whole scene, how the light affects the color of the whole scene. So there are different options in here. Max comes with a linear multiply option, which usually makes geometry and materials really bright. So we're going to start having some white artifacts over the geometry. So what we recommend is just like taking this option, which is a pixel mapping. It's going to create more samples on those white surfaces, avoiding having those white artifacts. And in here we can also play how much darkness or brightness we want to see in the overall render output, whether I want more bright colors or want more dark in the whole overall. Right. That one. I think that's it. All right, now we're going to explain that after we got the settings of the work in progress or final rendering, you're just going to submit the scene to a final render. That one. Mm-hmm. So what we're going to do in here is just create a render elements that will be useful for enhancing and for composing all the post-production file. So in render elements, we just need to tick this option and start adding all the elements we want in the scene, in the post-production file. So we got like from multi-matte element to V-Ray alpha, there are many. You just gotta select which one you're gonna use, whether it's a reflection, whether it's reflection. So just gonna take in here in the multi-matte element. So if I, for instance, if I just want to get a mask of a specific geometry on the scene, let's say like these beams, I'm just gonna right-click. I select the object first, then right-click, get object properties. I'm just gonna set up the ID I want to have. In this case, I got the ID number 7. Click OK, and in multi-matte, it gives us the options to type the number of ID I want to render. So for our scenes, we can have like many multi-mattes. Like it depends on how many mattes you want to create for manipulating later on in the post-production file.
When you set the output 2.2 gamma and you save it out to the multimatic, then you get a wrong exposure. Sorry.
No.
It'll save it the right.
It's going to save it the right way?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
Can you repeat the question? Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I just ask if you get the exposure 2.2 gamma baked into your multi-matte material, that's all.
Okay. Well, I mean, as long as like the software itself keeps the gamma for the whole rendering, so you don't need to worry about the gamma will be different at the time the Mac starts saving the passes or the final render. So in here, after I get the first pass of all the IDs I want to have as a mask in my post-production file, I'm just gonna say like I need a reflection pass. So there are two options: whether I use the V-Ray raw reflection or whether I use the V-Ray reflection that is in here. Thank you. Basically, the difference between these two passes is basically the intensity of reflection. Just like reflection, because the settings are pretty much the same, but when you open the post-production file, when you open the pass, you're gonna see that the raw reflection is 100% reflection of the whole environment over that material. We're gonna see that more in post-production. I'll start like showing how we use the passes, how we compose the whole image through passes. Yep. I'm just gonna do that. All right. Yeah. All right. All right. Well, the multimat is a way to, as I explained, to get a specific geometry mask. But in case we don't have time for selecting each part of the geometry and applying and changing properties in the object ID, there's also another option which is more general, which is the V-Ray watercolor. What it does basically is like each object of your scene has like a color. So in here, this is black, but I can change that color. So it depends how the geometry in your scene shows the color, like just like you're seeing right now here. We got the purple, yellow, subtle blue. That's how the watercolor will represent the past. So we can start like picking up, creating selections from that watercolor in a Photoshop file. I'll explain that later. But this watercolor is more in general, like usually if we don't have a clean file, like if we don't change the color, let's say if I don't have, just gonna select one geometry, if I don't have like a specific color in here, it'll just understand the colors the geometry came with. So it can have like, we can have like at least 10 to 20 different colors in the watercolor. So that's why it's more difficult to use these paths at the time of creating selecting masks in Photoshop. All right. One of the differences between multimat paths and the V-Ray watercolor, it is that the edges of the selecting mask are not as clean as they should be. The anti-aliasing seems to work better with the multimat element than the V-Ray watercolor. So we usually go for more multimat elements instead of V-Ray watercolor. But we usually send both options in case we forgot to select one object in the scene we want to get a mask from. All right, let's gonna render a tiny sample. All right. Right, so we're just rendering here. Okay, now that we got our render done, our final render, we're just gonna, if we're using the V-Ray frame buffer, we're gonna have the option of seeing each one of the passes we select, each one of the render elements we select. So we got the alpha, which is gonna be really useful for manipulating the background in the scene, or the sky in this case. The multimat, which is gonna like show the selecting geometry in RGB, in red, green, and blue colors. At the moment, I mean, like if we get close to our image, we're gonna see like the edges are not pretty clear, but that's because we're not using the image sampler properly. We're not using the anti-aliasing option. So if we start using the anti-aliasing option, we select the filter we want, definitely this is going to change. It's just going to render a small region. All right, sorry, just made a mistake. There you go. So as you see here, the edges, how smooth the edges are in our selected mask changed drastically. I mean, like right now we cannot see much because the render is small, but when we get a full high-res image, which is going to be between 4K or 5K, we're definitely going to see how jagged the edges are, or how sharp the edges are for our selected mask. So now that we got the multi-matte, we're just going to check the reflection pass. So it's basically the reflectivity that is capturing from the HDRI sky or what we got in the background. And the difference that I was mentioning before between the V-Ray reflection pass and the V-Ray raw reflection is how accurate the reflection is. The V-Ray raw reflection, we're going to have 100% reflection of the whole environment over our material. While in V-Ray reflection, it's just like a subtle reflection. That's the real reflection we see in our final render. But for post-productions, I usually prefer to go for a raw reflection because somehow I'm going to have the 100% reflection, so that will be easier to manipulate and create unrealistic values of reflection if we want to enhance the shape of the building. And we got the watercolor pass, which I was already explaining before, that it will render the mass of the elements according to the color of the geometry. All right, in render elements, there's also another way to get ambient occlusion if we don't want to use ambient occlusion in the indirect illumination setting. We can go here and use this setting, but this definitely is going to increase our rendering time. I would suggest to untick this option and render the occlusion separately, so we can also manipulate the contact shadows in our post-production file. So I'm just going to create quickly how to make the ambient occlusion pass. So basically, I'm just going to create a V-Ray extra text pass. It comes with a slot in here. So we're just going to have a standard V-Ray material. Yeah, we're going to just have a V-Ray dirt material over this slot. Just going to copy this V-Ray dirt over our material editor. And it's going to show us like some options to manipulate ambient occlusion, same as in the indirect ambient occlusion in here. So what we just need to modify is the radius that we want to see the ambient occlusion, how much amount of contact shadows we want between objects. So I would go for like low values, like between 1. It depends on the units of the scene. Like if you check the scene, the unit setup in this scene, let's say I got metric unit setup. So in here will start showing me the distance between how big the contact shadow will be. So it's 25 centimeters. 25 centimeters. So usually contact shadow shouldn't be longer than 0.60 or 1 meter distance from the object, from object to object. So I'm just going to place it in here, 0.60. All the setting keeps the same. The only setting that's going to change the subdivisions. If we want to have like a smooth transition in our contact shadows, just going to increase this to 25 or 30. So that's how we get the ambient occlusion without using ambient occlusion in indirect illumination. Where's the other one? Very fun. This is another pass that is really important to have if we want to create fog or depth in a post-production file, the V-Ray set depth. We just need to set up how much depth I want to see in the image. So in here, we got the set minimum value and we got the set maximum value. The farther you get, the better transition the fog will have. So let's say I'm just gonna have 500. Also adding another pass that will be really important if we want to modify shadows, if we want to make shadows brighter in the final render in Photoshop. So in V-Ray set is already set up. We're just gonna test a new render just to see how the ambient occlusion works. So if we check the V-Ray set pass, basically we're gonna see, we just render a small region, so we obviously won't be able to see how bright, the brightest point of the depth, but in here we can see like there's like a gradient of colors, that the closer it gets, the brighter it is. And the farther it is, the darker it is. This is the ambient occlusion. So for this scene, if we set up like a big distance between of the contact shadows, we're gonna have like a really dark areas between seats. So I would just suggest like to go for a short distance in here. I'll definitely go for 0.1 in order to not have all these contact shadows all together. And this is how V-Ray shadows pass is represented. Like in here, it's gonna show it as a bright spots, but later on in Photoshop, we're just gonna invert that pass in order to make the shadows brighter, or we can actually make the shadows darker. This one.
So we've got some scripts that we also use to set up some of the render passes, and Jason's going to go over those.
All right, so there's some scripts to kind of make this process easier. When you have a million objects in your scene like this, it can get kind of confusing selecting what object IDs you have, seeing what object IDs you've already used in your scene, just kind of to help organize all that and make it fit in one place. So the wire color pass, all these scripts are available on ScriptSpot if you need to find them. I can also give you a list at the end of class. Basically, if you select everything in your scene and you hit color by material, it's going to give that wire color that Freddie showed you. You can manually adjust over here. It's going to give it this wire color per material or by layer or random color, however you want to do it. Normally, color by material is the most useful for that pass that Freddie set up. So yeah, that's an easy way to make sure that gets done right before you hit render. It's good to run that and just make sure that if you've updated any materials or anything like that, it's up to speed. The other one is an object ID script. that Matt Richardson at Neoscape wrote. So this thing, basically, when you right-click to go into your object settings, Freddie showed you this gbuffer ID down here. This is a way to control all of that from this one script. So if you clear everything on your entire scene down here, it'll just get rid of them all and zero them out so that now nothing has an object ID. So you can start setting up these multi-mats from scratch, more or less. And you can assign, the way it's broken up is kind of more of the same, just in different spots. So you can assign using these buttons, or you can assign or select using this value up here. So I'm going to select by material here. I'm going to select this red. So if you select by material and you hit assign ID, and you just do this one by one, it goes pretty fast once you get the hang of this script and you have all your materials in your material editor already. Currently we have it reset. So if you hit assign and then you hit print right here on entire scene or selected, it'll show you what's being used in your scene. So 1 and 2 are the ones that I just set. So just so you're not overriding, you don't come back later and you pick your grass material and set it to the ID of 2 and have the same ID as another object on the same plane. So for instance, if you had set these people to 2 and then you set the grass to 2, they would all blend in that multi-mat. And the other cool thing about this script is that you can hit create here, and it creates the multi-mat for you and sets it up with the IDs that you need. So if I'm going to go through and randomly assign some stuff here. I'm going to hit print. So now I have all these IDs in my scene. Normally you'll have probably 20 by the end. You can delete what's in there currently from here as well. So you hit delete, that one goes away. Hit create, and it created both of them with the exact IDs that I just randomly assigned. So 14, 16. So those are all set up. And that's pretty much how that works.
So that kind of wraps up our work in progress 1 and 2. And now we're ready to jump into post-production with all of our render passes. So we're going to take a break for lunch, and then when we come back, it's going to be all about post-production. So thank you guys very much.